In a stunning move that has left Moscow reeling, Sweden has delivered a crippling blow to Russian forces, shifting the tides of the conflict in Ukraine. This unprecedented aid package from Sweden, NATO's newest member, marks a historic departure from its traditional stance of neutrality. What secret strategies and cutting-edge technologies has Sweden unveiled to support Ukraine? How will this affect the balance of power in the region? Let's delve into the dramatic developments that have sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and bolstered Ukraine's fight for freedom. On May 29th, Sweden announced its 16th aid package to Ukraine. Tellingly, this was primarily a military rather than an economic or humanitarian aid package. It is designed to create Russian casualties, which would have been unthinkable for Sweden a few years ago. Such aid is a departure from Sweden's traditional foreign policy. Until Putin decided to invade Ukraine, Stockholm observed a policy of neutrality dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. The last time Sweden entered a conflict was in the Swedish-Norwegian War of 1814. The Swedish public widely supported their country's neutrality, and it was maintained during both world wars. As late as 2012, only 17% of Swedes expressed support for joining NATO. By 2021, the number increased to 46%. But Sweden was always wary of the threat from Russia. The two countries fought the long and bitter Great Northern War in the early 18th century over influence in the Baltic Sea. Sweden lost the conflict and has been on guard against Russia ever since. As early as 1904, Sweden was patrolling the Baltic with submarines to protect its coastline. That mission has given it more underwater experience in the Baltic than any other nation. The Gripen fighter was designed specifically to counter the threat from Russia. Even its radar system is designed to let it look toward Russian territory without flying in its direction. Fear of potential Russian aggression has entered Swedish cultural consciousness. Some of the older locals on Gotland Island, one of the most important locations in the Baltic and the likeliest place in Sweden that Russia would attack, reported in 2015 that they would hear stories from their parents warning that if they failed to finish their dinners, the Russians would get them. Back then, people on the island were divided over whether Swedish military should increase their presence there. No such divisions exist today. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine reawakened historical nightmares among the Swedish public and policymakers in Stockholm. Sweden announced its intention to join NATO a few months later and quickly became a partner to help Ukraine fend off the invasion. Like Germany, Sweden reversed its historical aversion to providing lethal military aid. It began with providing weapons like anti-materiel weapons, air defenses, and light vehicles. The investments increased, and Sweden demonstrated early on that it was willing to go far in its proportional investment in money and weaponry. On the first anniversary of the war, Sweden said it would donate 10 Leopard 2A5 tanks to Ukraine. Sweden's latest aid package is worth $1.23 billion. To put that into perspective, Sweden's total military spending in 2023 was $8.75 billion. Meanwhile, Sweden's total aid to Ukraine amounts to a little over $4 billion over the course of 16 packages since the invasion started. Such a proportionally large expenditure demonstrates Stockholm's threat perception. Russia's recent successes have required Stockholm to step up its spending even more. The pace of Sweden's separate aid packages also reflects Stockholm's wariness, as several have been passed in the last few months, and they have significantly increased in size. For example, in late February, Sweden announced a $682 million aid package, which was then its largest. The package included 10 CB-90 combat boats, 20 group boats, underwater weapons, $192 million worth of badly needed artillery shells, RBS-70 man-portable air defense systems, anti-tank missiles, Carl Gustaf grenade launchers, hand grenades, and medical supplies. Early in May, Sweden passed aid to help Ukraine secure its energy supply, since this section has been a particular target for Russian missiles and drones. This aid will be spent on equipment like generators, transformers, and solar cells. It will also include necessary spare parts like electrical switches, cables, pumps, and pipes. The May 29th aid package was about twice the size of the February aid package. It does not include donations of the JAS-39 Gripen fighter jet. Although Ukraine has expressed interest in this platform in the past and does not rule it out in the future, Kyiv wants to focus on implementing its F-16 program. Stockholm says that it's still working on the possibility of contributing the Gripen system later, but for now it's too much of an ask for Ukraine to divide itself between the two new fighter jet programs. Though it won't be able to donate fighter aircraft, the rest of the aid is substantial. Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Ebba Busch, said that the package consists of equipment that is at the top of Ukraine's priority list. Maybe the most important contribution for the immediate term is in the form of additional 155mm artillery shells. Sweden didn't specify how many shells will be provided, but the new ammunition will help to swell Ukraine's supply to well over 2 million rounds. This will ensure enough ammunition to keep Ukraine in the fight into 2025. The Swedes will also be donating RB-99 AMRAAM missiles, the equivalent of the AIM-120. Sweden's Ministry of Defense says that these missiles will be repurposed specifically to serve in ground-based anti-aircraft systems. Presumably, they'll be supplied for Ukraine's NASAMS units. This is important because Russia took to using its aviation to more effectively support its ground forces after Avdiivka fell, and the proper air support enabled Russian forces to make more rapid advances to the west. Ukraine used its NASAMS and other air defense units to shoot down some of the Russian planes. More ammunition will check Russian aviation and force Moscow to be more cautious with its air power. Sweden will also be sending its entire fleet of PBV-302 infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. These have been retired from Swedish service as the newer Combat Vehicle 90 replaced the PBV-302 in 2014. Stockholm thought it better to donate its older vehicles rather than keep them in storage. Sweden's official announcement of the aid mentioned that the Ukrainian army was organizing several new brigades and needed armored vehicles for their infantry companies, a demand the PBV-302 will help to satisfy. The PBV-302 is armed with a 20mm cannon mounted on a turret to the vehicle's right side. The cannon can be fed with drum magazines, which can each hold 30 rounds. A 7.62mm machine gun can be used as a secondary weapon. It has armor that can withstand 20mm rounds and weighs 12.3 tons. It comes with a crew of 3, the driver, who also serves as a mechanic, the gunner, and the commander. The vehicle can carry up to 8 soldiers in its landing compartment. Over 600 of these vehicles were produced between 1966 and 2014, but that's not the amount Ukraine will receive. Much of the fleet was decommissioned from 2005 onward. By 2018, there were at least 180 still in service in various degrees of readiness. These vehicles are likely the ones Sweden will now hand over to Ukraine. The vehicles are all set to be repaired and modernized to at least some extent before the transfer. The remaining spare parts and maintenance equipment for these vehicles will be donated as part of the package, as will the 20mm shells for the onboard cannons. The PBV-302 will not be the only land vehicles Sweden donates as part of its latest package. The aid also includes surplus fuel transport vehicles in use by the Swedish Armed Forces. Previously donated Swedish material will continue to get upkeep through this aid package. Stockholm intends to help Kyiv with its command and control through donations of terminals with subscriptions for satellite communications. To help with training and military doctrine, the Swedish Defense Research Agency will assist the Ukrainian Armed Forces in creating their own Defense Research Institute. There are also a number of financial support provisions in the package. Most importantly, Sweden will make investments to ensure that Ukraine can get aid on a large scale on a rapid basis. Sweden will permit all of the weapons provided by this package to be used against targets on Russian soil if that's what Ukraine finds proper. Stockholm also claims that it will be able to replenish all of the ammunition and equipment it's sending to Ukraine through new investments. The most notable contribution in the package came in the form of 2 Saab ASCC-890 airborne early warning and control planes. Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson said that these aircraft would have the most significant impact on Ukraine's air defense network. These planes will better allow Ukraine to identify and track incoming missiles and drones. They can also spot targets of opportunity for offensive operations. Training Ukrainian Air Force personnel to fly these planes is also part of the Swedish aid package. Stockholm's decision to donate these aircraft was a significant step beyond the monetary cost. These were the only 2 AWACS aircraft in Sweden's fleet. The Swedes admitted that the donation of these planes and many other provisions in the package meant a temporary vulnerability in their territorial defense. However, they decided to take what Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson called a calculated risk. Perhaps the words of his Danish counterpart, Mette Frederiksen, came to mind. Early in 2024, she pointed out that it was better for European countries to sacrifice their own arsenals temporarily to ensure Russia's defeat far from their own homelands, rather than having to potentially use those weapons against an emboldened Putin far closer to home. Sweden plans to make up for the shortage of command and control planes by purchasing additional S-106 GlobalEye aircraft. This is Saab's newest AWACS aircraft and entered service in 2020. Sweden also insists that it has plans to replenish all of the ammunition and other equipment it will lose once they arrive in Ukraine. Sweden intends to do this by increasing its defense spending. In September 2023, Stockholm announced its intention to increase its military budget by 28% for 2024. Additional increases will come in 2025 and 26. These increases will put Sweden over the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by appropriations. The budget increases will also likely make Sweden an enduring and reliable partner for Ukraine. Stockholm has indeed already announced that its partnership with Ukraine will be for the long haul. On May 23rd, Prime Minister Kristersson said that Sweden will be providing Ukraine with $7 billion in aid over the course of 3 years to repel the invasion. The package released to Ukraine the following week was only the first of multiple packages to come, and those packages will likely get bigger as time goes on. Thanks to the increases in Sweden's military budget over the coming years, the country will be in position to deliver on this planned aid. The Ministry of Defense officially announced major planned investments in artillery systems and transport aircraft as part of the domestic defense spending program. These investments will put Sweden in a position to produce and deliver the weapons and ammunition Ukraine needs in the coming years. But how does Sweden's recent and coming aid impact Ukraine's ability to win the war of attrition? In December 2023, a report by the Estonian Ministry of Defense indicated that Ukraine could win the war in 2025 if it killed or maimed 100,000 Russian troops in 2024. While Russia has the ability to call many more soldiers than that to its colors, these people need to be trained properly and then assigned to a cohesive unit if they are to be effective on the battlefield. These units would quickly suffer casualties, creating even more demand for manpower that would in turn send troops to the front with even less training. It will be a vicious cycle that Russia, even with its much greater amount of available manpower than Ukraine, would not be capable of meeting. The Estonians estimated that if Ukraine met the 100,000 benchmark, it could reduce Russian training capacity to 80,000 properly trained troops per year. The rest would be ineffective cannon fodder. Sweden's donation, especially with the new artillery shells, will help Ukraine to achieve this objective. Since Ukraine killed or maimed an average of 172,000 Russian troops in each of the first 2 years of the war, this seems like it will be achievable, particularly with help from countries like Sweden. There is another side to this equation though. Ukraine must minimize its own losses, and that's where Sweden's recent aid package might make the most impact in the long run. Estonia's Ministry of Defense said that it was just as important to level up the training Ukrainian troops received from their Western allies. Over 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained by their Western allies since the war began. The training is not equal though. While most Western militaries have basic training courses that take 10 weeks, and then several months for more specialized tasks like demolition or sniping, most of the Ukrainian troops in the war have had only 5-week courses. Ukrainian troops have also sometimes complained that they have received improper training from their NATO allies, which have been influenced too heavily by the war on terror rather than the high-intensity state-based warfare that's taking place in Ukraine. This lack of adequate training has also ensured that Ukraine suffered about 200,000 casualties in the first 2 years of the war. Of particular importance is better training for Ukraine's officers. The Estonians recommended that foreign trainers should subject Ukrainian staff officers to a 10-week intensive training course. That way, Ukraine will be able to conduct proper operations at the brigade level. The current Ukrainian military can't do this at the moment, which is why most operations in the war have taken place at the platoon or company level. This approach to warfare has helped to keep Ukrainian armed forces nimble, but it's also had severe limitations. The Estonian Ministry of Defense pointed out these limitations. The effective span of control of a brigade for offensive operations is therefore approximately 2 companies. The result is that the Ukrainian military plans and executes operations with a horizon of exploitation limited to approximately 1,200 meters. This assessment may have been one of the more understated reasons why the offensive in Zaporizhzhia last year failed, even though Ukraine was able to penetrate 2 of Russia's formidable defensive lines there. It could not translate those gains into a bigger breakthrough because of Russian mines and improved artillery fire, but also because it simply could not effectively use the necessary amount of troops to conduct operations at the level required. Russia was able to summon reinforcements with helicopter support that halted the momentum of Ukraine's troops. Being able to bring more of them forward in a cohesive operation could have made the difference in generating the necessary momentum. Unfortunately for Kyiv, this was not available, but Sweden might be starting to change that. Sweden's assistance in creating a defense research institute for Ukraine could help with training its staff officers, preventing casualties, and ensuring more comprehensive operations at the brigade level, although this will take time to see results. It is time that Putin thinks he has on his side, but Sweden's coming aid sends the message that he might be wrong. Ukraine is well on the way to killing or maiming 100,000 Russians this year, even though its forces may have been slowly giving ground. The end of Ukraine's shell hunger, partially with the ammunition Sweden is set to deliver, will help ensure Ukraine stays in the fight for the war of attrition and can get past the contentious American presidential election. Sweden has emerged from over 200 years of military neutrality with surprising speed, and while there may be doubts about the feasibility of continuing to aid Ukraine in the United States, in Sweden there are none. Sweden doesn't have the luxury of an ocean to separate it from its old enemy. For Stockholm, it's better to defeat Russia on foreign soil than potentially need to defeat it on soil or in waters close to home. Even proportionally large investments and temporary depletion of domestic arsenals have not dissuaded Sweden's leaders from this opinion. Putin may hope that many of the countries that now oppose him will become exhausted with Ukraine over time and lose interest in continuing the effort. For deep historical reasons, Sweden is unlikely to be one of those countries, and that's important because it might be proportionally small, but it has a strong defense industry. It will also look bad if Sweden, the newest member of NATO and also one of its smaller participants, were to continue supporting Ukraine at significant cost to itself while the others did nothing. Sweden's support helps to ensure a broader European effort that could continue onward even if American aid falters. Sweden's historic decision to step up and deliver a significant blow to Russia through its aid packages marks a new chapter in the conflict. As NATO's newest member, Sweden's support highlights the unwavering commitment of Ukraine's allies to ensure regional stability and security. What impact will Sweden's aid have on the war dynamics? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: Ukraine is not alone in its fight for freedom. What do you think of the support Sweden has lent to Ukraine throughout the war, and how will it affect Kyiv's ability to win the war of attrition? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Australia just dealt Russia a crushing blow, or click this other video instead. It's January 2024, and General Patrick Sanders stands before an audience at the International Armoured Vehicles Exhibition in London. However, the general doesn't merely have vehicles on his mind. A much bigger problem troubles him: Russia. During his speech, Sanders stresses that the UK needs to achieve a mental shift, particularly when it comes to the British public and its collective preparedness for war. Conscription still isn't on the table, the general says, but the country's army as it stands right now isn't strong enough. He tells the audience that the UK needs to modernize and may even have to build a citizen army that's ready for a land war. He then delivers a chilling warning. Within the next 3 years, it must be credible to talk of a British army of 120,000 folding in our reserve and strategic force, but this is not enough. Why will it not be enough? Again, Russia. Sanders' speech rattles a few cages at 10 Downing Street. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak dismisses Sanders' words, saying that presenting hypothetical scenarios isn't helpful to anybody. That especially goes for the general's comments that the Ukraine war has shown that it's not regular armies that win wars, it's citizen armies. The UK should follow in Ukraine's footsteps, he argues, or at the very least, be mentally prepared to do so. His message is clear: the UK has no choice but to prepare for war with Russia. And his statements lead to some questions. Why does the UK have to prepare, and just how credible are Sanders' claims? Assuming the general is correct, how would the UK fare if it faced Russia today? And what, if anything, is it doing to prepare for a war with one of the world's largest militaries? To begin answering those questions, we must first dive into the relationship between the UK and Russia. Both nations have essentially been at peace since the end of the Crimean War and have been allies fighting alongside each other in 2 world wars. Given that somewhat friendly history, how have relations between the two countries fractured to the point where the UK needs to be ready for war? It all starts with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise to the Russian presidency in 2000 marked the end of the cooperative relationship the UK enjoyed with Russia following the end of the Cold War. That end didn't come immediately. Rather, a series of events slowly transformed the relationship from one of cooperation into one of confrontation, perhaps starting with an infamous incident, the 2006 murder of Alexander Litvinenko. A former officer with the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Russia's replacement for the KGB, Litvinenko was a Russian spy who had become critical of his country. In 1999, Litvinenko earned the FSB's ire when he claimed that the agency had begun colluding with the Russian mafia and was responsible for several apartment bombings in Russian cities that Russia then used to justify the Chechen War. But perhaps more dangerous to Litvinenko, according to a 2016 report by The Guardian, was that he had a personal vendetta against Putin. When Putin became the director of FSB in 1998, 2 years before he ascended to the presidency, Litvinenko met with him to argue against the corruption he saw in the agency. Putin listened to him make his case and did nothing, creating bad blood between the two. It's likely this incident that prompted Litvinenko to leave FSB and flee to Britain in 2000, where it's believed he started working for the MI6 spy agency and developed associations with former Chechen leader Ahmed Zakayev and a Russian oligarch named Boris Berezovsky, both critics of the Kremlin, both enemies of Vladimir Putin. If those associations weren't bad enough, Litvinenko was also not shy about attacking Russia's president. In July 2006, he wrote an explosive article in which he claimed Putin was a pedophile who had abused his position as the head of FSB in the late 1990s to destroy videotape evidence of himself having sex with underage boys. Add to that further accusations that Putin was responsible for the October 2006 murder of a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, and Litvinenko had placed himself on Putin's hit list. It wouldn't be long before Putin enacted his revenge. In November 2006, Litvinenko was killed inside the UK through the use of a poison named polonium-210, which had been administered to a cup of tea. The inquest that followed revealed that Litvinenko was being paid by MI6, though the specific terms of his employment weren't revealed, and that he had been targeted by assassins. Specifically, the two men he met for that fateful cup of tea, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, were accused of being the men who administered the poison. However, they weren't acting alone. The inquest revealed that Putin likely greenlit the order to kill Litvinenko. The assassination triggered a turning point in UK and Russian relations, with the UK being incensed over the fact that Russia would kill somebody on British soil. In addition, Russia had been uncooperative with the investigation and even refused to extradite one of the suspects. Several Russian diplomats were expelled from the country in response to the killing, along with the UK ending its intelligence cooperation with Russia and freezing some of its assets. If nothing else, the incident showed the UK that Putin was willing to violate the country's laws to get what he wanted. Litvinenko's assassination wouldn't be the last time this happened. In March 2018, a Russian double agent named Sergei Skripal was poisoned in the UK. A former officer with Russia's GRU agency, a military intelligence unit, Skripal and his daughter were found slumped on a park bench 8 years after arriving in the UK as part of a spy swap deal in 2010. Both survived. Two Russian men, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Borisov, were accused of the crime, and details soon emerged that demonstrated the covert nature of their attempted assassination. Skripal was poisoned using a Russian-made military-grade nerve agent, with the poison having been applied through the squirt of a perfume bottle. Russia denied all involvement. It claimed that rogue elements had somehow gained access to the nerve agent and had used it without the Kremlin's knowledge. Britain's then Prime Minister Theresa May gave Putin 24 hours to prove his claims, which he failed to do so in the eyes of the British government. By March 2018, the UK was saying that there was no alternative conclusion other than the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Another attack on citizens inside the UK, and yet another incident that further soured the relationship between Britain and Russia. The Guardian claimed in 2018 that the incident plunged the relationship between the countries to its lowest depths since the 1980s and the cruise missile crisis. But those relations would reach new depths in February 2022. On February 17, 2022, the UK created new legislation that would give its ministers the power to impose fresh sanctions on Russia's businesses and oligarchs. The decision came in the wake of growing tensions in Europe as Putin appeared to be gearing up to invade Ukraine. About a week later, Russian soldiers started a war that continues to rage to this day. The UK joined the rest of the Western international community in condemning the war and used its new powers to levy sanctions. It also began supplying aid to Ukraine, along with many other countries, with Britain's contributions having reached $54.2 billion in value as of July 2024. All of this backstory matters because it paints a picture of the two countries that have experienced continued fracturing of their relationship over the last 24 years. Through his assassination attempts, Putin has shown that he not only lacks respect for the UK and its laws, but that he's willing to deploy agents into the country to get what he wants. He has set a precedent. Russia has operated in Britain before, and it may well do so again. Only this time those operations would escalate into full-scale war. Assassinations, secret plots, and sanctions combined do not create an atmosphere in which that war would occur. It's what's happened since Russia invaded Ukraine that has led the UK to the point where it needs to prepare. Take the repeated threats from Russia as an example. In February 2024, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev commented on the concept of Russia returning to the borders it had in 1991. Doing so would be untenable, claimed Medvedev, who now serves as Russia's Security Council head, as it would mean Russia would have to give up the territory it's taken in Ukraine, as well as Crimea and Chechnya. Speaking on Telegram, a social media platform that's popular in Russia, Medvedev issued a chilling threat. Attempts to return Russia to the borders of 1991 will lead to only one thing: towards a global war with Western countries using the entire strategic arsenal of our state. Medvedev then claimed that any attempt to return to those borders would represent the West forcing a direct and irreversible collapse of Russia, before he built on his strategic arsenal comments. Threats were levied against Kyiv, Washington, Berlin, and London, with Medvedev claiming all four have long been included in the flight targets of our nuclear triad. Better to return everything to how Russia wants it, demanded Medvedev, or Russia will return it themselves, with maximum losses for the enemy. The context here is simple. Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike Britain if the UK takes part in any concerted effort to force Russia to return to its old borders. Suddenly, General Sanders' comments about the need to be prepared are cast in a new light. Perhaps they're not a case of scaremongering, but instead the statements of a man who has seen enough to know that Russia is a clear threat. Sanders sees the deterioration of the relationship between Russia and Britain, with Medvedev's nuclear threats only confirming that he's likely right to be worried. Speaking of those nuclear threats, just what would Britain face if Russia pushed the nuclear button? In 2023, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, estimated that Russia has a stockpile of 5,580 nuclear weapons. About 1,200 of these have been retired, meaning they're no longer in active stockpile and are awaiting dismantling. Of course, given that they aren't dismantled yet, those nukes could still be used if Russia felt the need. However, more worrying for Britain are the 1,549 strategically deployed nuclear warheads. These are warheads that are currently installed on ballistic missiles and ready to launch at a moment's notice. It's unknown how many of that 1,549 are directed at Britain. However, we do know that Russia easily has enough nuclear weapons to level the United Kingdom. In October 2022, the UK-based Sky News ran a report in which it examined the threat that Russia's nuclear weapons pose. General Sir Richard Barrons, a British defense expert, is quoted when commenting on Putin's decision to place his nuclear deterrent forces on high alert in March 2022. Speaking about Russia's weapons, he claimed, "The warhead at the front of it has a yield between 300 and 800 kilotons. It would take just one of these nuclear weapons to destroy London," Barrons says. The UK isn't helpless on the nuclear front. The ACA highlights that it has 224 nukes of its own, plus it's allied with France and the United States, which are both NATO members and nuclear states that would come to Britain's defense if it was attacked on its own soil. But by that point, it would be too late for Britain. Russia has more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of the UK's major cities. Of course, these are far from the only nuclear threats that Russia has thrown around. It has a long history of using the threat of nukes to try and get its way, dating back to the Cold War era. Yet another nuclear threat, albeit one made in response to the possibility of Russia losing its current borders, may not be enough to convince Britain that it needs to prepare for war. But Medvedev's is far from the only threat made by Russia to the UK. During a state visit to Ukraine in May 2024, former British Foreign Secretary David Cameron committed to delivering at least $3 billion in military aid annually to Ukraine for as long as is required. However, that wasn't the headline from the visit. Instead, it was a single quote that made waves. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself. The quote was taken as Cameron's indirect way of permitting Ukraine to do something it had previously been unable to do, use British-provided weapons to attack Russia on its own soil. While Cameron's comments provided room for doubt, further comments made by new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer removed that doubt entirely. Speaking to Bloomberg journalists on July 9, 2024, Starmer claimed that it was up to Ukraine to decide how it would use British weapons, including the long-range Storm Shadow missiles the UK has been sending. Those missiles can travel for 155 miles, far enough for Ukraine to launch them from within its own territory to strike at Russia behind the front lines of the war. Russia was incensed. In the wake of Cameron's comments, Moscow summoned Britain's ambassador to Russia to the Foreign Ministry to deliver a message. Any strikes made by Ukraine on Russian territory using weapons supplied by the UK would force retaliatory strikes on British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere. The implication is that elsewhere could mean on British soil. Yet another threat, and yet another justification for General Sanders' comments that Britain needs to prepare. The UK didn't backpedal on Cameron's statements in the wake of Russia's threats, with Starmer's July 2024 comments only adding fuel to the fire. Russia argues that Britain is needlessly escalating tensions. The UK's refusal to back down means that the threat of war between the two countries is higher than ever. However, it's not just direct threats against Britain that could lead to the UK and Russia going to war. It's Putin's threats against British allies. In January 2024, the British government released a risk analysis that claimed there is a 1 in 4 chance that Russia will launch an attack on a British ally within the next 2 years. That analysis came just days after General Sanders' warnings and the government's shooting down of those warnings, with the report describing Russia as an adversary state throughout. The report claimed that there was a 25% chance of Russia attacking a non-NATO ally, such as Sweden. Of course, Sweden has since become a member of NATO, potentially reducing the possibility of such an attack. But if it were to occur, Britain would find itself going to war not because it was attacked directly, but because it was bound to do so by Article 5 of the NATO Convention. The article essentially states that an attack on one NATO member's soil is treated as an attack on all members, with those who aren't being attacked duty-bound to come to the defense of the country that's being targeted. The message here is simple. Russian aggression toward countries like Sweden, Finland, or the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia could mean war between Britain and Russia. NATO hasn't lowered these tensions. If anything, it's exacerbated them with the creation of Operation Steadfast Defender 2024. Touted by NATO as the organization's largest military exercise since the Cold War, the joint effort saw 90,000 troops from all of NATO's 32 members converge on Europe to conduct a host of military exercises between January and May 2024. The exercises were split into two parts. First, the United troops would carry out a series of exercises focused on securing the Atlantic Ocean through to the Arctic Ocean. From there, ground-based troops would move across Europe, traveling from the north of the continent through its center and finally into Eastern Europe. NATO's stated goal was simple: demonstrate the organization's ability to defend every inch of its territory. The message to Russia was also clear, as NATO's exercise was designed to showcase that its forces are ready and waiting to fight should Russia launch an attack on a NATO ally. The UK was among the most heavily involved nations in Operation Steadfast Defender, as it sent 16,000 troops, a little under a fifth of the NATO total, and reinforced its commitment to collective defense. Once again, we see an escalation of tensions. Putin has repeatedly warned NATO nations not to get involved in his war against Ukraine. However, Russia's continued aggression has prompted many NATO nations, including the UK, to take stock of their defensive strategies in preparation for what some see as an inevitable war. This collective escalation could place the UK in a position where it has no choice but to go to war with Russia to support other NATO members. Finally, there's one more suggestion that the UK needs to gear up for war with Russia. Its own people think that war is inevitable. That's according to a YouGov poll conducted in February 2024, which quizzed Britons on whether or not they believed the country needed to get ready for a global conflict. Over half, 53%, believe that there will be another world war in the next 5 to 10 years, with 15% claiming that such a war is very likely. Another 38% say that war is somewhat likely, while a further 16% simply don't know one way or the other. On the plus side, 44% of those polled believe that the UK and its Western allies would prevail in a war over Russia and its allies, compared to just 13% who think Russia would win. Where does all of this leave the UK? One of its leading generals claims that war is coming. Since 2000, Britain has seen its relationship with Russia deteriorate enormously, to the point where the UK is referring to Russia as an adversary state in official reports. Moscow has levied threat after threat at Britain in 2024, ranging from mentions of nuclear weapons to warnings of strikes on British military facilities and equipment if Ukraine uses British weapons inside Russia. NATO appears to be preparing for war, having conducted one of the largest cooperative exercises ever during the first half of 2024. And Britain would likely be a major part of that war. And as YouGov reveals, most Britons appear to side with General Sanders and his belief that the war is coming. All of which brings us to another question. Is the UK ready to fight Russia? The simple answer appears to be no, or at least it's not ready to fight Russia alone. Every year, Global Firepower, or GFP, compiles a list of 145 countries with militaries, ranking them based on over 60 factors to determine which is the strongest. The United Kingdom performed well in the 2024 version of this list, achieving a ranking of 6th out of 145. The problem is that Russia came second, and it overpowers the UK in practically every department. Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel, compared to 184,860 in the UK. Russia also has over 1 million more reserve personnel, though the UK comes in with an impressive 924,000. The UK's defense budget is about half of Russia's, and its air force is far smaller, with 664 aerial assets compared to Russia's 4,255. Russia has more tanks, over 130,000 more armored vehicles, and crucially, a navy that contains 664 more assets than the UK's Royal Navy. The last point is important. Britain's island status means that a conventional war would require Russia to attack via sea. Adding to all of this is the nuclear issue discussed earlier, as Russia has enough nuclear weapons to decimate the UK if conventional warfare doesn't do the job. General Sanders recognizes Britain's comparative weakness. In July 2024, he warned that NATO, and Britain by extension, only had about 5 years to prepare for war with Russia. Honing in on Britain's defensive capabilities, he praised the UK's ability to combat cyber threats, as well as its ability to defend against terror attacks. But in a full-blown war, it will be found wanting. We have a huge gap in air defenses, the general claims, adding that Britain needs to ensure that its skies are protected with greater investment and that the undersea cables that we rely on are protected from Russian sabotage. In other words, Britain needs to spend more on its military. Which brings us to the final key question posed in the video. What is the UK doing to ensure it's ready for war with Russia? We've already seen some examples. For instance, the UK taking part in Operation Steadfast Defender 2024 is a purposeful effort to reinforce its defensive ties with dozens of other nations. Cooperative defense will form the majority of the UK's strategy against Russia, as it will lean on Article 5 of the NATO Charter to ensure that other powerful nations, such as France, Germany, and the United States, fight alongside it should Russia attack Britain on its own soil. The UK has also been busy signing security partnerships outside of NATO. For instance, 2017 saw it sign a trilateral submarine agreement that also involves the US and France, with 2021 bringing with it a similar agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia. Though these agreements don't compel any of the signees to come to the other's aid in times of war, the fact that they exist at all suggests that Britain will have plenty of allies on which it could rely during a war with Russia. Of course, allies alone won't win a war. The UK needs to prepare internally. It appears to be doing that by committing to the level of investment General Sanders believes is required. In April 2024, Chatham House reported that former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had pledged to continuously increase Britain's military spending until it reaches 2.5% of gross domestic product, or GDP, by 2030. That would put it above NATO's 2% of GDP guideline, adding an extra £75 billion, or $96 billion, to Britain's defence budget over the next 6 years. Britain's July 2024 general election initially cast this budget in doubt. However, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer has reiterated Britain's intention to hit a 2.5% of GDP target, meaning military spending has survived a changing government. However, these budgetary increases may not be enough. The Institute of Fiscal Studies points out that the £75 billion pledge only works out if the UK intends to freeze its budget every year between 2024 and 30. In other words, a large amount of that money would have been accounted for within existing increases to UK defence spending, which is already at 2.3% of GDP. Taking that existing commitment into account, rising to 2.5% of GDP only adds £20 billion, around $25 billion, to the budget. While still a large amount of money, most of it will go toward plugging current funding gaps in Britain's military. That means it's having to spend more to play catch-up with Russia rather than spending to strengthen a fighting force that was already capable of winning a war. Nevertheless, the UK has been ordering and building more weapons since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. December 2022 saw it spend almost $300 million on thousands of next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAWs, from Swedish manufacturer Saab. NLAWs can destroy a modern tank from a distance of up to 2,600 feet and would prove extremely effective in a ground war, given Russia's demonstrated reliance on tanks in Ukraine. A further $115 million was committed to buying L403A1 assault rifles, which feature stronger optical sighting systems than Britain's current rifles, as well as a muzzle signature reduction system. The UK government website suggests that up to 10,000 of these rifles may be purchased between 2023 and 33. Forces.net also reported that the UK is investing in drones capable of firing bullets costing as little as 13 cents per round in May 2024. The point here is that the UK is spending the money it has intelligently. It's seen Russia's extensive use of tanks in Ukraine and is investing in NLAWs and drones due to the success Ukraine has enjoyed with both. Purchasing new rifles also means Britain's soldiers would likely be better equipped than Russia's on the battlefield. However, it likely needs to spend more and faster if General Sanders' prediction of a conflict within 5 years is true. Right now, Britain's navy doesn't match Russia's in sheer size, even given the fact that much of the Russian navy is made up of patrol boats and smaller warships. Its aerial forces, as Sanders points out, are also not at the level they need to be to establish aerial dominance against Russia. Help from its allies could bolster the UK. But if it's to win against Russia, it likely needs to do more. That may mean an even greater commitment to spending, as well as increasing cooperation with its allies to ensure that collective defense is really what it's touted to be if Russia's aggression extends to Britain's shores. But what do you think? Does the UK really need to prepare for a war with Russia, or is General Sanders focusing on a future that's unlikely to happen? What else should Britain do to bolster its military? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out "The UK just gave Putin a devastating blow," or click this other video instead. At the 2024 Lennart Meri conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. "We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All three, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty. And that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these three countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all three nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kharkiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20th, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic Common Defense Zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well, to 61,000 by 2032, and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991 saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II. And again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of de-Russification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The 3 states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All three will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand, or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying the Baltic states, or click this other video instead. Russia has spent much of the 2010s and 2020s pushing boundaries in Europe. We witnessed this in its 2014 annexation of Crimea, which saw it claim an enormous amount of territory from under Ukraine's nose. Of course, the Ukraine war followed almost a decade later, with Russia having been embroiled in that conflict since February 2022. However, it's a mistake to assume that Ukraine is the only target of Russian aggression. Several other countries, particularly those that previously fell under the Soviet yoke, have also started to feel pressure as Russian President Vladimir Putin's ambitions become clearer. Finland is one of those countries. Unbeknownst to many, Finland has been the subject of a hybrid warfare campaign conducted by Russia for several years, with Putin clearly trying to push boundaries and exert his influence in the Nordic country. But Finland won't take Russia's constant prodding and poking lying down. It's preparing aggressive action, especially after a series of incidents that have let the country's leadership know that it's a target for Putin. That brings us to the main questions we'll answer in this video. What is Finland planning, and why is it gearing up to potentially fight against Russia? Before we dig into the answers, it's important to understand that Russia and Finland have a deep history of conflict that dates back to the 12th century. During that time, the country we know as Finland was essentially a political vacuum that attracted the attention of its neighbors to the east and west. To the west, Sweden wanted to control the region, ideally to establish it as a territory overseen by the Catholic Church. In the east, Russia was eyeing the same patch of land for a similar reason, only it wanted to establish rule based on the tenets of the Greek Orthodox Church. Thus, the first wars over Finland involved Sweden and Russia, with the results being a peace treaty signed between the two nations in 1323. Sweden took most of Finland, though Russia didn't leave empty-handed. The treaty at least gave Russia portions of East Finland. Still, Swedish rule pervaded for several centuries thereafter, marked by numerous cultural shifts. Though Finland adopted Swedish legal and social systems, its people were never subject to full Swedish rule. They still had personal freedom, which laid the foundations for early Finnish culture to start forming in the mid-1500s. It was around this time that the Lutheran interpretation of Christianity began to spread around Europe, eventually replacing Sweden's Catholicism. That Reformation came to Finland in the middle of the 16th century, bringing with it the first Bibles written in the Finnish language. The country's culture was becoming ever more established, but Sweden was still a major factor in its existence, which spent over a century between 1617 and 1721 extending its empire's borders around the Baltic region as a consequence of Russia's then weakness. Sweden also turned its attention to finally establishing full rule in Finland during this period, appointing Swedes to many positions of high office in Finland in the process, but Swedish rule wouldn't last forever. Russia has continued to harbor ambitions over Finland in the centuries since it signed the 1323 peace treaty with Sweden, with the 19th century finally delivering an opportunity to strike. Sweden, weakened considerably during the early parts of that century, opened the door for Russia to invade Finland between 1808 and 1809. Finland became a Grand Duchy of Russia in 1809. Interestingly, this marked the first time that Finland was treated as a collective entity. Before Russia's successful invasion, it was merely a collection of provinces, each with its own rules, that were loosely governed by Sweden. Now, as a Grand Duchy of Russia, it was essentially its own state, and with that new collectivism came the emergence of a truer Finnish culture. This was actually aided by Russia. Alexander I, the Russian emperor who served as Finland's Grand Duke between 1809 and 1825, essentially gave the territory autonomy. It was still answerable to him, though other Russian authorities couldn't interfere. The Finnish language became more widespread, aided by a language decree signed by Alexander II in 1863 that made Finnish an official administrative language in the Russian Empire. Legislative work was enabled by the reconvening of the Finnish Diet in 1863, with the country even building its own military thanks to the 1878 Conscription Act. those good times couldn't last. With the chaos caused by the Russian Revolution of 1917 came the declaration of Finland's independence from Russia in December of that year. Though Finland and Russia didn't go to war over this, the emerging Soviet Union was still determined to take control of the country. The opportunity arose during the buildup of tensions that led to World War II. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany during that period. This pact contained a secret protocol that would see Finland, along with the Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia, assigned to the Soviet Union in what would essentially be a Europe that Russia shared with Germany. The pact was put into practice in 1939 when Joseph Stalin and his Soviet army invaded Finland. The Winter War followed, with Finland managing to come out on top, but this marked a dubious period in Finnish history. Unable to get help from the West, Finland allied with Nazi Germany, in part because the Nazis declared war against the Soviet Union in 1941. That decision meant that Finland was once again subjected to partial Soviet rule in the wake of World War II, with 10% of its territory being handed over to Russia as part of the Moscow Armistice. The 1948 Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance it signed with Russia also made Finland more dependent on the Soviet Union economically and politically, resulting in further isolation from the rest of Western Europe. Finland would remain under this indirect Soviet control for most of the 20th century. It was only the end of the Cold War that allowed the country to regain its full independence. Finland took advantage by joining the European Union in 1995. Nevertheless, Finland decided not to join NATO for a long time afterward. Why does all of this matter? The brief history lesson demonstrates the long-standing and often confrontational history that Finland has with Russia. It's a country that was subjected to the Soviet yoke almost as much as those that were officially part of the Soviet Union, and it spent much of the last 3 decades attempting to strengthen its independence and its ties with Western Europe. Russia isn't happy about that. In fact, it's likely that Putin considers Finland an illegitimate country just as much as he considers Ukraine to be the same. That's the suggestion of the Atlantic Council, which published an article analyzing Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson in February 2024. In what essentially amounted to a warped history lesson as seen through Putin's lens, the Russian leader claimed that Ukraine was an artificial state and dismissed the idea of a Ukrainian nation as an anti-Russian conspiracy. The Atlantic Council suggests that he could apply what it calls the same bogus historical argument to invade other countries that have previously been ruled by Russia. Those countries, as you learned earlier, include Finland. And that brings us to what Russia is doing that appears to support these claims. It certainly hasn't declared war. After all, Russian troops are tied up in Ukraine, and an attempt to fight a second traditional war with Finland at the same time could have disastrous consequences for Moscow. However, traditional isn't the route that Putin is following in his approach to Finland. Instead, he's engaging in what appear to be the early actions of a hybrid war that could be setting Finland up for a future invasion. A hybrid war, as described by the NATO Review, is a fusion of conventional as well as unconventional instruments of power and tools of subversion. The goal of this type of war isn't necessarily conflict, at least not on the level seen in Ukraine. Rather, the country waging this war aims to inflict damage by blurring the lines between aggression and peace, essentially creating an elusive war that the target nation may not even be aware exists. Russia has used several hybrid warfare tactics against Finland since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Each is designed to destabilize the country, perhaps in preparation for a future invasion if Putin's special military operation is successful in Ukraine. Russia's first tactic: overwhelming Finland with illegal migrants. At least that's the accusation that Finland levied at Russia in November 2023. The BBC reports that Finland's Prime Minister, Petteri Orpo, believes that Russia has been helping migrants cross the 833-mile border between the two countries. This claim was backed up by other Finnish officials, who claim the migrants are arriving at the border in cars before jumping onto bicycles so they can get across the border to claim asylum in Finland. Worse yet, Finland's leaders believe this is all being done with the help of Russian border guards. The statistics they revealed seem to support their allegations. Finnish border guards say they registered 89 crossings over 2 days between November 12th and November 14th, 2023. The number for the previous 4 months was just 91. Interestingly, the composition of those illegal migrants also suggests a Russian influence. That's according to Finnish border guard Colonel Matti Pitkäniemi, who said that many of those who crossed were of Syrian, Iraqi or Yemeni descent. All had arrived legally in Russia, but were not yet approved for entry into Finland. The use of bicycles is also interesting, as it exploits a loophole in Finnish rules that allow border crossings for cyclists. That loophole has since been closed, but as Orpo said in the news conference in which he made the accusation, it's clear that these people are helped, and they're also being escorted or transported to the border by border guards. In other words, Russia is allowing these migrants into the country with the express purpose of transporting them to Finland. The problem has only worsened since that 2023 report. In February 2024, Reuters reported on Finnish claims that thousands of these third-country migrants who arrive in Russia from another country before trying to get into Finland, are waiting to cross the border. That comes on the back of Finland shutting down all border crossings from Russia toward the end of 2023 amidst its accusations that the Kremlin is trying to funnel people into Finland. The report also shows that the numbers kept rising from November 2023. In fact, the full month saw more than 900 migrants attempt to claim asylum. Given that the BBC reports that only 91 people attempted the crossing in 4 months leading to November 12th, that means that almost all of those attempted crossings came in the latter half of the month. More evidence of a concerted campaign orchestrated by Russia. Finland sees this organized and illegal migration as part of a hybrid warfare campaign. Ultimately, this is designed to upset the peace and quiet of several Finnish towns, such as Hollola, which Finland says will be disrupted by the immigrants Russia sends. For what it's worth, the Kremlin denies all of Finland's accusations. But that's exactly what it would do in a hybrid warfare situation in which the goal is to create confusion and discontent. Assuming Russia is responsible, it will likely be happy that it's forced Finland to step up its border patrols while investing in drones and similar equipment. Planned Finnish legalization may even allow the country to call on thousands of its reservist troops to stem the migration flow. All of these resources cost money and manpower, representing an excellent result for Putin. This isn't the only example of Russia using its border with Finland to escalate tensions between the two nations. In January 2024, Russia officially terminated a border agreement it had with Finland that dated back to 2012. The decision came in the wake of Finland's decision to join NATO, which had prompted threats from Putin that Finland's actions would lead to problems. That agreement was designed to promote cross-border collaboration between the two countries. Russia claims that Finland had already broken that deal, with Politico reporting that its foreign ministry summoned Antti Helentara, the Finnish ambassador, to tell him as much. According to Russia, the confrontational actions of Finland against Russia and discrimination against Russians on the basis of national origin in the issuance of entry visas was the cause of the decision. Again, we see hybrid warfare tactics at play. Russia's decision to withdraw from the border agreement carries the not-so-subtle message that Russia and Finland aren't friends anymore. Moscow has even managed to paint Finland as the bad guy in the situation. It mentions Finland's refusal to allow the Russians into the country as grounds for the termination, while conveniently leaving out that the majority of those Russians are actually third-country migrants Moscow is purposefully funneling toward the border. In truth, the agreement had been unofficially suspended since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, but Russia waited before making the termination official, using the time to weaponize migration until it reached a point where it could accuse Finland of breaking the agreement. Very clever. And as Chatham House points out, it's a tactic that Russia has used before. For instance, the summer of 2021 saw Russia supposedly cooperate with Belarus to move Afghani and Iraqi migrants to the border that Belarus shared with Poland and Lithuania. That move led to more physical conflicts, as well as protests by the migrants that placed pressure on the two countries Russia targeted. Through this, we can see that Russia's border games are part of a grander plan. They're designed not only to force the country to dedicate resources to a problem it didn't anticipate having to solve, but also force division. As Chatham House also points out, creating migration problems out of thin air for these nations allows Russia to deepen the migration divisions within the European Union. Essentially, the migrants are being used as pawns in a geopolitical chess game. Deploying them could allow Russia to create rifts within the EU, which would, in turn, chip away at the united front the organization's members have presented against Russia in the wake of the Ukraine war. Fortunately for Finland and the EU as a whole, Russia's tactics have come to light. Chatham House says that the EU has not only recognized the important role Finland has played in securing the group's northern borders, but is actively supporting it through the current crisis. Staff, financial support, and equipment have all been offered as Russia pushes more migrants to the Finnish border, appearing to indicate that Moscow's actions have simply deepened ties within the EU. That wasn't the reaction that Putin wanted. But he can still be satisfied with the chaos he caused. Besides funneling migrants to the borders isn't the only hybrid warfare tactic he's waged against Finland. There's also the polar bear. In October 2023, a Chinese-owned container ship named the New Polar Bear, along with a Russian cargo vessel called the Sevmorput, wreaked havoc in the Gulf of Finland. At least that's the opinion of the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, which points out that both were in the area at the same time that a pair of telecommunications cables and an undersea gas pipeline were damaged. The New Polar Bear became the focus of this incident. It was tracked moving through the Baltic Sea and eventually arriving at Arkhangelsk with an important part missing, its portside anchor. That very anchor was discovered by the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, lodged into the seabed near the damaged pipeline 2 days after the Chinese ship arrived in Russia. Was the damage done on purpose? Of course, the sailors of the Chinese ship say it wasn't, but Finland was far from convinced. 2 months of investigation followed, culminating in Finland declaring in December 2023 that all signs it found indicated that the new polar bear had sabotaged the telephone cables and pipeline intentionally. As Finland's Minister of European Affairs, Anders Adlercreutz puts it, "I'm not the sea captain, but I would think that you would notice that you're dragging an anchor behind you for hundreds of kilometers." It's a fair point, with further suspicions arising due to the new polar bear heading to a Russian port following the incident before immediately sailing back toward China. Adlercreutz claims that he can't speculate on Chinese government involvement, though his words clearly suggest he suspects the supposed accident was a deliberate attempt at sabotage. Russia's potential involvement is even murkier though, and one of the points of hybrid warfare. It's entirely possible that China attacked the telephone and gas lines via a container ship, allowing it to claim innocence by virtue of a mistake, and did so to help Russia sow further seeds of chaos for Finland. At the very least, Russia may have created another inconvenient situation that Finland had to clear up, just as it's done by funneling illegal migrants to Finland's borders. By now, Finland appears convinced that Russia is conducting a hybrid warfare campaign against it. There's been no direct conflict yet, and everything Russia seems to be doing is obscured by a veil of semi-plausible deniability. But Finland sees through that veil and is preparing aggressively for what it may believe is a coming war with Russia. The question now is simple: how? The most obvious answer is that Finland has finally joined NATO. That move had been open to Finland for decades, but it's one that it avoided taking due to its desire to maintain military neutrality. Through that neutrality, Finland believed it could at least maintain a cooperative relationship with Russia, as evidenced by the 2012 border agreement that has now been terminated, while maintaining its ties to the West. That approach has been scrapped entirely. As of April 2023, Finland is officially part of NATO. Russia's actions are the reason why. According to the country's Prime Minister Alexander Stubb, Finland's decision to join was a done deal as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine. The BBC speculates that many Finns saw the writing on the wall, and that invasion reminded them of the 1939 Soviet invasion of their own country, which led to the Winter War. Finland doesn't want to find itself in that situation again, which is why joining NATO now is such a good move. Doing so means it's part of a collective force, and that it's protected by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that an attack on any NATO member's territory is considered an attack on all NATO members. That alone may dissuade Russia from turning its attention to Finland after the Ukraine war concludes. Putin isn't best pleased about Finland's decision. Back in May 2022, he promised to take retaliatory steps both of a military, technical, and other nature in response to Finland's plans to join. Perhaps the hybrid warfare tactics we see Russia employ are part of those steps. Regardless, Finland is now part of a multi-nation group that will support it directly if it ever needs to defend itself against Russia on its territory. Speaking of defending itself, Finland is far from a lame duck when it comes to military might. Though global firepower only ranks it 50th out of 145 nations as part of its annual 2024 Power Index ratings, Finland is a surprisingly militarized nation. As the BBC estimates, the country's military has a wartime strength of 280,000 members, with Finland also training 21,000 conscripts per year to give it a reserve force of 900,000 soldiers. That's massive, considering that it's a country that has a population of just 5.5 million. Pub Affairs Bruxelles digs deeper into the Finnish military strength. It notes that Finland has around 200 German-made Leopard 2 tanks, along with about the same amount of infantry fighting vehicles and 613 armored personnel carriers. Throw in 682 artillery units, and Finland brings a respectable ground fighting force to NATO. The country also understands its own geography when it comes to naval war. Finland's coast is jagged and difficult to breach at the best of times, with the country's navy making that even harder with a focus on mine warfare. It has 5 mine layers in its navy, along with a trio of Katanpää-class mine countermeasure ships, indicating how Finland thinks a naval invasion of the country might go. Reuters offers even more details. It points out that Finland's 682 artillery units are part of what the country calls Western Europe's strongest artillery, and that they're backed up by about 700 mortars and 100 rocket launchers. It also has 650 missiles and has committed to investing in more. Even its infantry is properly catered for, as Finland maintains enough firearms, including assault rifles, grenade launchers, and anti-tank weapons, to equip its entire reserve of 900,000 people. Add winter wear, gas masks, and night vision goggles, and you have a military that, though small compared to Russia's, is extremely well prepared. Speaking of winter wear, you also can't disregard Finland's experience in cold weather fighting. If the Winter War of 1939 taught us anything, it's that a small Finnish force is more than capable of fighting in cold weather to fend off a superior Soviet force. Chatham House notes that Finland's resilient strategies, should a similar invasion happen again, are held in high regard. It says Finland would take advantage of its expansive forests and lakes to launch raids on Russian invaders, preventing them from reaching the country's core population areas. In other words, Finland would play a vital role in holding up Russian forces if they attacked, giving the rest of NATO time to prepare collective defenses against Putin's military. It's also raising its military budget. That's according to Reuters, which said in August 2023 that Finland plans to commit 2.3% of its GDP to its military by 2024. That's above the NATO recommendation of 2%, suggesting that the country is looking to both restock and improve in the face of Russia's hybrid warfare. So we see Finland strengthening its already impressive military and building ties with countries that could help it defend itself with its decision to join NATO. But the Finnish response goes even deeper. The country appears to be actively working alongside the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Poland's Center for Eastern Studies highlighted this collaboration in September 2023 when discussing how all four nations are building up their border defenses. In Finland's case, that involves the construction of barriers, split into 8 sections, across around 124 miles of its border. Each would be located on a permanent road border crossing point with Russia, as these crossing points lead to the highest concentrations of infrastructure and population on Finland's side of the border. The cost of erecting these barriers is estimated to be around $380 million, with construction anticipated to wrap up in 2026. The news was a prelude to the May 2024 announcement that Finland, the 3 Baltic states already mentioned, and Poland had signed a joint agreement to work together to prevent Russia from circumventing EU sanctions. The agreement will see the 5 nations, which essentially serve as the EU's border with Russia, agreeing on ways to ensure uniformity in enforcing sanctions, as well as sharing information about what's happening at their borders. While neither indicates a military buildup, both the construction of barriers and increased cooperation with neighboring states appears to be clear responses to Russia's migrant tactic. The point of all this is that Finland isn't sitting back and allowing Russia to get away with whatever it wants. Through cooperation with its neighbors, it hopes to tackle border issues. Investment into barriers will do the same, and by joining NATO, as well as investing so heavily into its military, Finland is preparing itself for the possibility that Putin may follow up on his hybrid tactics with a full-blown invasion in the future. If he does, Finland will be ready. It'll also benefit from the collective support of 31 other countries should tensions with Russia escalate. Still, Finland finds itself conducting something of a balancing act. It can't show weakness to Russia because that would give Putin confidence that he could launch an invasion once the Ukraine war ends. But at the same time, Finland can't afford to get too aggressive with its actions. Russia's hybrid warfare tactics are designed to muddy the waters and potentially allow Russia to paint Finland as a villain. That's why Finland is building up its military, joining NATO, and working together with other nations that also have borders with Russia. All are defensive actions that set the stage for future aggression if it's needed. But what do you think about Finland's response to the hybrid warfare tactics Russia appears to be employing? Is the country rightfully preparing itself for the possibility of being one of Putin's next targets? Or are those very preparations likely to make it even more of a target, especially given Putin's opinions on NATO? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how will the US react if Russia attacks Finland, or click this other video instead. Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started, and with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia, and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia, even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine. He knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France, and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict. And with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck 2 facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict, and yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says it could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all-in aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains: Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do: using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. "We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means," he said before adding, "Even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack." In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war. We look forward to checking out your comments, and thank you for watching the video. On April 13, 2024, Iran launched a barrage of attacks against Israel, sending over 300 drones and cruise and ballistic missiles its way. Yet not a single drone or cruise missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. For the most part, Israel has its multi-layered air defense system to thank for this extraordinary success rate. Still, the country wouldn't have been able to pull off this remarkable achievement without a hastily assembled coalition, including the US and the UK, which helped shoot down Iranian drones over Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. The speed and effectiveness at which allies came together to protect Israel brought one question to the forefront: why can't the same level of coordination and support be extended to Ukraine? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was the first to pose the question, shortly followed by the German parliament, the famous Bundestag. In a rare feat, both the leading and opposing parties in the Bundestag were in favor of deploying the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukrainian airspace. But how would this protection work? Would Germany be the only country to commit resources? And why does Ukraine need so much help in the first place? These are just some of the questions we'll answer as this video progresses. But first, let's see how this important idea started brewing in Germany. The German parliament members, MPs, were actually the first to put this idea forward. It initially came from German military experts like Nico Lange, a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus, a former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. However, it's the Bundestag that has the power to turn this idea into reality, so it shouldn't be surprising that the proposal only gained significant traction when taken up by German parliament members. As mentioned, and as reported by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a German media outlet, both the members of the ruling liberal-left coalition, the Greens and the Free Democratic Party, as well as the members of the opposing Christian Democratic Union, supported the idea of deploying NATO air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace. Here's what MPs from these parties had to say on the matter. Markus Faber of the Free Democratic Party discussed the feasibility of Ukrainian protection plans in the long run. He pointed out that there's currently a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So according to Faber, step one would be securing a sufficient number of these systems. Only then should the Western allies fully commit to protecting the Ukrainian skies. Roderich Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union explained what kind of effect this commitment would have on Ukraine. According to him, shooting down Russian drones over Ukraine would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. And given how forcefully Russia has been attacking that front in recent times, Ukraine can't afford to miss any opportunity to strengthen its defenses. But how would this strengthening even work? Agnieszka Brugger, the deputy chair of the Greens, explained which part of the Ukrainian airspace could be protected by NATO, as well as which countries should be part of this endeavor. In her words, the air defense systems should be deployed on the borders of countries that border Ukraine, so that they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, the chairman of the German Committee on European Affairs and a member of the same party, further specified which countries could be expected to help protect Ukraine in the long run. According to Hofreiter, Ukrainian airspace could be protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania. The plan is to establish a safe zone extending some 43 miles into the Ukrainian territory and protect this zone using the NATO Integrated Air Defense System units stationed in these two countries. The NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, NATINAMS for short, is a command and control network that combines the radar, missile systems, and aircraft of NATO member countries to ensure comprehensive air defense coverage and coordination. The Center Allied Air Command of all NATO member countries in Europe is based at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which coordinates centers spread all over the continent. Both Romania and Poland house an air operations center, the former in Baltic and the latter in Poland, Warsaw Pry. Both countries also have a rather developed complex of radar stations, which makes them ideal candidates for helping to protect Ukrainian airspace. As far as their equipment goes, the Polish Air Force boasts the Backbone system, comprised of 3 NUR-12M and 3 RAT-31DL long-range radars, while the Romanian Air Force possesses 5 ANFPS-117 air search radars distributed across 5 radar stations. But as you probably know, radars alone aren't enough to ensure effective air defense. That's why additional air defense systems would have to be set up on the territory of these two countries. For now, we can only speculate on what these systems might be based on the model used for this proposal, the Iranian attack on Israel. With this in mind, let's look at how this attack unfolded and, more importantly, how it was thwarted. Sometime after midnight on April 13th, the Israeli air raid alerts blasted through the night. Citizens were urged to seek shelter as explosions erupted in the distance. The reason for these alerts lay in the 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles launched by Iran, targeting strategic locations throughout Israel. However, the explosions echoing through the air weren't the sounds of these missiles and drones hitting their target. No, they were the sounds of successful interceptions. Only a handful of the 110 ballistic missiles managed to reach the country, while none of the 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles had the chance. This was made possible by the swift reaction of several countries. The projectiles were fired from Iran's territory as well as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They were intercepted and downed by Israel, the US, the UK, and Jordan. Let's start with Israel. As part of the first line of defense, the country sent the F-35 combat fighters to intercept the projectiles. This was possible due to the fact that most of the projectiles were sent from relatively far away. The shortest distance from Iran to Israel is about 620 miles and includes the airspaces of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. With this swift action, Israel was able to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside the country. For any projectile that managed to slip through the first line of defense, Israel used the Aerial Defense Array, a newly installed national air defense system. The system in question has been in place since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, and it consists of 3 layers. Layer number 1, the Arrow Missile Defense. The highest tier of the Aerial Defense Array was used to physically intercept long-range ballistic missiles, and it did so successfully, primarily relying on the Arrow 3 exo-atmospheric hypersonic anti-ballistic missiles. Layer number 2, the David's Sling. The middle tier of the Aerial Defense Array was employed to take out short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, downing them as far as 186 miles away from Israel. Layer number 3, the Iron Dome system. This system is the reason why none of the 170 drones fired by Iran reached Israeli airspace, let alone any of their targets. Though this system was initially designed to protect cities and strategic sites against unguided rockets, it's recently been upgraded to take out drones as well, a decision that has obviously saved the day in Israel. So that's how Israel alone defended its territory against the incoming threat, but what about the allies? According to US President Joe Biden, the US forces helped Israel take down nearly all drones and missiles launched on that fateful Friday. The US Central Command, CENTCOM, went into more detail. According to CENTCOM, its forces took out over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, some of which, 1 missile and 7 drones, were destroyed before they were even launched from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Others were downed over southern Syria, with air defense systems deployed from undisclosed bases in the region. 2 aircraft and 2 destroyers that the US moved to the region before the Iranian attacks also helped, shooting down 4 to 6 ballistic missiles. But as helpful as these counterattacks were, they weren't the most significant contribution to the Israeli defensive operation. The US intelligence was. The intricate command and control system set up between the US, Israel, and some Arab neighboring countries provided extremely precise intelligence that essentially helped Israel neutralize all the threats coming its way. So the US did its fair share in defending Israel. What about the UK? The UK also rose to the occasion, sending Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets to shoot down a number of Iranian drones. As for Jordan, you might be surprised to see this country among the nations helping down threats coming for Israel, given how critical Jordan was of the Israeli actions against Hamas in Gaza. However, Jordan didn't do it for the sake of protecting Israel, despite having a peace treaty with the country. It did it to protect its citizens, as a number of Iranian missiles and drones entered Jordanian airspace. Remember, Jordan was a part of the shortest route from Iran to Israel. For this endeavor, Jordan relied on its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets, which proved extremely useful, even at night. France was also involved in the conflict, but there's no official information on whether the country downed any drones or missiles. For now, all that's known is that it helped patrol Israeli airspace. Given how comprehensive the response to the Iranian attacks was, it shouldn't be surprising that only 5 ballistic missiles managed to evade air defenses and impact Israeli territory. 4 of them landed in the Air Force base housing the Israeli F-35 fighter jets, the very same jets used to defend Israel against Iran. The only missile that did any damage hit a runway. The others hit hangars which were either empty or out of use. The fifth ballistic missile did manage to reach Israel, but it didn't reach its intended target, a radar site in the north of the country. So there you have it, a masterclass on how a well-coordinated and multi-layered air defense system, supported by international collaboration and advanced technology, can effectively neutralize a significant missile and drone threat. So what's the issue? Why can't the same be done in Ukraine? Well, for starters, Ukraine's air defense system doesn't even come close to the sophistication and integration of Israel's air defense network. This rang true even before the Russian invasion, but the conflict has further exacerbated the challenges. As Zelensky put it, Ukraine lacks the sufficient air defense equipment to protect the country against the Russian terror. However, he also declared that another, more important element was missing for this defense: the world's determination to protect Ukraine and stand up against Russia in the skies. That's the reason Zelensky asked for Allied help to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the first place. As he pointed out, neither Israel nor Ukraine are NATO member countries. So if NATO allies can help protect Israel against missiles and drones, what stops them from doing the same for Ukraine? Unfortunately, the answer is rather simple: a fear of drawing NATO into a war against Russia. Though the Israeli scenario demonstrated that NATO allies can interfere without joining the conflict, it seems that the situation in Ukraine is viewed through a different geopolitical lens. That's why the US and the UK outright refuse to commit any resources to guarding the Ukrainian airspace. As John Kirby, the White House National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, explained the US's refusal to help Ukraine in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. Though he did add that President Biden always made it clear that the US had no plans to directly engage in the conflict in Ukraine. The country is, however, Ukraine's #1 military aid provider by a margin, which means the US provides Ukraine with the necessary weapons to protect its airspace, and this is no small feat. As for the UK, the country's Foreign Secretary David Cameron was a bit more direct when addressing the UK's refusal to help Ukraine shoot down Russian drones. In an interview with LBC, a UK radio station, he outright said that the reason for the refusal lies in the fear of escalating the conflict into a direct confrontation with Russia. His exact words were, "If you want to avoid an escalation in terms of a wider European war, I think the one thing you need to do is avoid NATO troops directly engaging Russian troops. That will be a danger of escalation." Cameron added that using fighter jets to down drones, as the UK did in Israel, isn't always the best option. Air defense systems are more effective. In other words, Ukraine needs air defense systems and not fighter jets. The UK lacks the former, or at least the systems that would make the biggest change, the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. However, a lack of sufficient air defense systems isn't the only reason why Ukraine is desperately asking Germany and other NATO allies for help. The problem also lies in the proliferation of Russian drones. Russia was somewhat slow to adapt drone technology, but it's now making up for it by growing its fleet at an unprecedented rate. This particularly applies to the so-called kamikaze drones, a kind of aerial weapon designed to loiter around a target until it's located and then attack it by crashing into it. Russia is going all out on these drones. At first, Russia imported them from Iran, opting for the country's Haysa Shahed 136 models. In 2 years, Russia has imported thousands of these drones and fired over 4,600 of them. With a reported weight of about 440 pounds, they fly as fast as 115 miles per hour and have a flying range between 620 and 1,550 miles. Though the Shahed 136 drones were believed to be extremely cheap for unmanned aerial vehicle technology, a leaked correspondence suggests that Russia has been paying between 193,000 and 290,000 per drone. The former figure applies to batches of 6,000 drones, while the latter is for batches of 2,000 drones bought. That's likely why Russia has set up domestic production facilities that allow it to be substantially less dependent on Iranian drones. According to reports, Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones domestically by the summer of 2025. And the more drones that are produced, the more will be launched against Ukrainian targets, depleting the country's anti-drone ammunition. To make matters worse, Russia has also been experimenting with modifying the Shahed 136 to make them even more destructive. Some of these experiments include spraying drones to reduce detection and adding cameras to enhance reconnaissance capabilities. Though these modifications are yet to make any change in the Russian war effort, they serve as a concerning reminder that Russia will stop at nothing to advance its military capabilities and crush Ukrainian resistance. These incessant efforts also include working with Iran on developing new attack drones specifically for the war in Ukraine. The drones, cited as a huge concern for Ukraine, are described as explosive and reconnaissance drones that could potentially seek out high-value targets, including the US and UK multiple launch rocket systems used on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Shahed 107 drones, as they are called, are roughly 8 feet long, can be launched from a vehicle, and have a flying range of up to 930 miles. Another testament to the Russian "the end justifies the means" mentality is the fact that the country has children producing its drones. Yep, you heard that correctly. Activists from the cyber resistance group published a series of documents that prove that the previously mentioned Shahed 136 combat drones are manufactured by underage civilians enrolled in the Alabuga Polytech College in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. In 2024 alone, these unexpected manufacturers are expected to produce 10,000 drone units. To reach this staggering number, over 500 students have been allocated to the drone production project. That's roughly 40% of the total number of students enrolled in 2023, which was 1,209. These students are engaged in various fields of manufacturing, including electric installation, industrial robotics, and numerical control programming. Given Russia's unscrupulous but unyielding efforts in the drone department, it shouldn't be surprising Ukraine needs all the help it can get in the skies. Though to be fair, Ukraine boasts pretty impressive interception rates, given the threat it faces every day. But when it comes to suicide drones, only a 100% interception rate would be considered satisfactory. Why? Because even if a single drone reaches its target, it can unleash devastation and take many lives in the process. Worst of all, the Ukrainian success rate at intercepting drones is gradually decreasing. The first few months of 2024 have been particularly challenging, as Ukraine has stretched its air defense units to their limits, facing an onslaught of Russian drones hitting cities with deadly accuracy and frequency, and Ukraine has only managed to shoot down about 82% of them. This begs the question, how low will this rate go before the Western allies interfere? As things stand, Ukraine can only defend itself against these deadly attacks with their help. The help in question could come in two forms. Number one, the Allies can supply more air defense systems to Ukraine, prioritizing models designed to intercept drones. Number two, the Allies could get involved more directly. They can support Ukrainian efforts to strike crucial targets like air bases, manufacturing facilities, and drone storage sites within Russia. After all, destroying Russian drones before they're even launched is the most effective way to protect Ukraine from the devastation they cause. The second approach also includes downing the already launched drones, which is what NATO essentially did for Israel. So will Ukraine be as lucky as Israel anytime soon? As things currently stand, the answer is unfortunately no. Well, at least as far as the second, more direct approach goes. You see, the German proposal to use NATO-integrated air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace has been rejected by the ruling party, the Social Democratic Party. Why? For the same reasons the US and UK refuse to help Ukraine. It's simply too dangerous. To quote the head of the Social Democratic Party, Rolf Mützenich, protecting Ukrainian airspace via a NATO deployment would go against the principle of not becoming actively engaged in the war. Mützenich used two simple words to describe what this proposal could be: fire hazard. And the fire in question could consume not just Ukraine, but NATO as well. However, it's highly unlikely German MPs will just give up on the idea. After all, we're talking about a country that has helped Ukraine massively since the beginning of Russian aggression, so much so that it's become the second largest provider of military aid to the country. A great deal of this aid has also been focused on the Ukrainian Air Force specifically. Here's a brief overview of all the air defense systems Germany sent to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. 9 TRML-4D air surveillance radars, 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 52 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with spare parts, 146,000 rounds of ammunition for the Gepard guns, 4,000 rounds of practice ammunition for self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems, 3 Iris-T SLM and 1 Iris-T SLS air defense system with missiles, and 2 Patriot air defense systems with missiles and spare parts. And that's not all. As of May 2024, Germany plans to further raise these numbers by sending another Patriot air defense system and more Patriot missiles, 2 more Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 9 more Iris-T SLM systems, 11 more Iris-T SLS systems, and additional Iris-T SLM and Iris-T SLS missiles, and 15 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with 249,680 rounds of ammunition. In the drone department, Germany has been equally generous. So far, the country has sent the following equipment: 212 vector reconnaissance drones with spare parts, 215 RQ-35 Hydron reconnaissance drones, 18 Promoco-1 reconnaissance drones, 7 Songbird reconnaissance drones, 70 frequency range extensions for anti-drone devices, 84 anti-drone sensors and jammers, 180 RF-360 drone detection systems, 93 drone sensors, 1 Lunar NG reconnaissance system, 10 anti-drone guns, 12 electronic anti-drone devices, and 20 unmanned surface vessels. Plus, in the coming months, Germany will send an additional 263 vector drones, 34 Hydron drones, 15 anti-drone sensors and jammers, and 50 unmanned surface vessels. Though each of these pieces of equipment is a lifesaver for Ukraine in its fight to protect its skies, none are arguably as important as the Iris and Patriot air defense systems. The Iris systems gifted by Germany have so far demonstrated a 100% kill rate in the Ukrainian war, managing to shoot down all targets, even when facing overwhelming odds. This system has also proven incredibly successful against the notorious Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. One look at the capabilities of the Iris air defense systems, and these success rates will make perfect sense. The Iris missile itself has a range of up to 25 miles and can hit targets flying at an altitude of up to 66,000 feet. The system's radar has a detection range of up to 155 miles, which allows it to track targets with high precision. But the best thing about this system is the agility of the Iris missile. This, paired with an active radar proximity fuse and improved heat-seeking homing, allows the missile to take out fast-moving and small targets like those often seen in Russian attacks on Ukraine. As far as the Patriot air defense system goes, it offers a higher altitude defense against ballistic missiles, aircraft, and drones, sort of like the highest tier of the Israeli aerial defense array. As Ukraine lacks native air defenses, it heavily relies on the Patriot system to safeguard its airspace. According to Zelensky, Ukraine needs about 25 of these systems to successfully do so. However, so far Germany has been the only country that has sent multiple Patriot systems and batteries to Ukraine. Despite Zelensky's pleading with allies to follow in Germany's footsteps, none of the other NATO countries that possess these systems, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, and Sweden, have committed to sending them. As for the US, the country sent one Patriot system in 2022. However, it plans to send more in 2024 as part of a massive aid package. But what makes Germany different from all other allies is, the country hasn't just been sending military aid to Ukraine, it's also been tirelessly pleading with other allies to do so. That's why this current push to use the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukraine seems so promising. As mentioned, Germany has been particularly proactive about Ukrainian air defense. In April 2024, the country launched a new initiative to secure more critically needed air defense systems for Ukraine. As Germany's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, puts it, stronger air defenses are a matter of life and death for thousands of people in Ukraine and the best protection for our own security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz continued these pleas by urging European allies to look at their stocks and provide whatever air defense systems they can to Ukraine. Of course, he highlighted the importance of the Patriot systems, which are the only systems that can counter all Russian attacks, whether via aircraft, missiles, or drones. Now, European countries are facing a choice: meet NATO's capability targets for their own states or provide more aid to Ukraine. However, even NATO seems to be pushing for the second option, joining Germany's efforts. The alliance's Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, said that sacrificing individual countries' stockpile targets for the sake of aiding Ukraine is the only right choice. For now, it seems that the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and Denmark might be the first to rally behind the proposal. Polish officials have also previously discussed the possibility of aiding Ukraine more directly, but so far no concrete decisions have been made. Though if Germany succeeds in realizing its proposal, Poland will undoubtedly have a major role to play in defending Ukrainian airspace. But what do you think? Do you believe Germany will manage to find a way to protect Ukrainian airspace from drones? And if so, will Russia see this move as a clear message that Ukraine isn't alone, or just as an invitation to start an all-out war? And finally, which countries besides Germany will risk this all-out war to help Ukraine? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world watched, expecting Kyiv to fall within days under the might of the Russian army. But more than 2 years later, Ukraine has not only survived, but has bested Russia on multiple occasions. How did this happen? The answer lies in military aid from over 50 countries, with one European nation standing out: Germany. Germany, initially hesitant, has become Ukraine's strongest European ally, providing extensive financial aid, military training, advanced weaponry, humanitarian relief, and diplomatic support. Yet even this powerhouse's efforts seemed insufficient, so Germany devised a bold new strategy to help Ukraine indirectly but effectively. What is this secretive plan? How could it create a defensive shield over Ukraine and potentially turn the tide of the war? In this video, we'll unveil Germany's daring strategy to utilize NATO air defense systems, the geopolitical maneuvers behind this plan, and its long-term feasibility. Let's dive into Germany's plan and discover how this unexpected hero is reshaping the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Germany wants to utilize NATO air defense systems to shoot down Russian drones over the west of Ukraine, effectively creating a semblance of a no-fly zone in the area. Given how much Russian drones have decimated Ukrainian forces and civilian areas, this defensive shield should help turn the tides in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But what would this defensive shield look like exactly? Well, it would cover some 43 miles of the Ukrainian territory, which would now become a safe zone under NATO's protection. The protection in question would come from the alliance's integrated air defense system units stationed in the neighboring countries of Poland and Romania. Of course, the primary reason for the involvement of these two countries is purely geographical. They're located to the west of Ukraine, precisely where the safe zone is to be established. The defense systems themselves would be placed as close to the Ukrainian border as possible. As Agnieszka Brugger, a member of the German Bundestag and the deputy chairwoman of the Alliance 90 in the Greens parliamentary group, puts it, it will be best to deploy air defense systems on the borders of countries that border Ukraine so they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, a fellow member of the Bundestag and the Alliance 90 in the Greens, was the one to specify that the said bordering countries should be Poland and Romania. His exact words were that the possibility of Ukrainian airspace being protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania should not be ruled out in the long run. The long run part is especially important, given that Germany is yet to receive a green flag to enter Ukraine in this way. More on that later. For now, let's discuss how the idea of entering the Ukrainian airspace even came to be. It begins with the April 13, 2024 attack on Israel by Iran, which fired more than 300 missiles and armed drones at Israel. Despite that barrage, Israel managed to deflect much of the attack thanks to a multi-layered air defense system, which consisted of 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. But that defense system itself isn't the primary reason Germany has contemplated installing an air defense system inside Ukraine. It was the response of Israel's allies that inspired German decision-makers to propose entering Ukrainian airspace. Israel's first layer of defense was the F-35 combat fighters. You're probably well familiar with this jet. After all, we're talking about arguably the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Originally, the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jets were produced by Lockheed Martin. They soon caught the attention of Israel, thanks to their advanced stealth and information processing capabilities, as well as an impressive supersonic speed of Mach 1.6. That's not to mention that these jets can carry up to 18,000 pounds of internal and external ordnance in what Lockheed Martin CEO Marilyn A. Hewson referred to as beast mode. So unsurprisingly, Israel became the first country after the US to acquire the F-35 jets, 50 of them to be precise. However, the country has since made significant changes to the model, manufacturing its own wings and electronic warfare system. The subsequent Israeli F-35 variant was named Adir, meaning the mighty one in Hebrew. The jet's might was on full display in April 2024 when these technological marvels were sent to intercept projectiles launched from the territories of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The F-35s reportedly managed to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside Israeli airspace. Now, sending fighter jets to intercept missiles isn't always possible. This decision is made based on speed, altitude, and trajectory of the incoming threat, as well as the capabilities of the available air defense systems. But since the projectiles coming at Israel were sent from relatively far away, there was time for the F-35s to take flight. Interestingly, some of the Iranian projectiles were seemingly targeting the Nevatim airbase, which houses the Israeli F-35 variants in the first place. This just goes to show the strategic value Israel and Iran places on its F-35 fleet and the effectiveness of these advanced fighters in countering threats. But mighty as they are, the F-35s couldn't possibly counter all the projectiles sent Israel's way. That's where Israel's long-standing multi-layered defense system took over. Layer number 1, the upper layer, consists of Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 ballistic missile defense systems. The goal of this layer is to intercept medium to long-range missiles. Layer number 2, the middle layer, is the so-called David's Sling. This innovative defense solution tackles short to medium-range ballistic missiles and larger caliber rockets. It's designed to strike the targets directly, shooting them down from as far as 186 miles away from Israel. And layer number 3, the bottom layer, is the famed Iron Dome. This mobile system defends Israel against short-range surface-to-surface rockets and unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. Iron Dome is the first missile defense system of its kind, and it's highly capable of handling multiple incoming threats at once, which it successfully proved in April. This system is the primary reason none of the 170 drones sent by Iran hit their targets. But as mentioned, the Israeli air defense capabilities weren't the only reason it was able to thwart the Iranian attack. The US, UK, Jordan, and France also came to Israel's rescue. The US downed over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, according to the US Central Command, or CENTCOM. Even more impressively, some of these projectiles were destroyed before even taking flight from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The rest were intercepted over southern Syria. The US also provided vital intelligence that armed Israel with the necessary knowledge to take out all the threats coming its way. As for the UK, the country's Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets downed an undisclosed number of Iranian drones. The same goes for Jordan, undoubtedly the most surprising ally to Israel. The country used its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets to fend off the Iranian attack. Though to be fair, the reason Jordan got involved appears to be more self-serving. The Iranian projectiles had to enter Jordanian airspace to get to Israel. So essentially Jordan was defending its country and citizens, not Israel. According to Brian Kachulis, a senior fellow of US foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, this move sends a clear message that Jordan and Israel have this shared interest in making sure that the airspace in their territory is defended. This leaves us with France, which did take part in Israel's defense, but primarily contributed by patrolling the country's airspace. As a result of this joint action, only a handful of the initially launched projectiles managed to reach Israeli territory, and it was only the ballistic missiles which managed to inflict minor damage near a runway at the Nevatim airbase and to a road nearby. Though the plan was to paralyze the base and thus damage Israel's air capabilities, Iran failed miserably, as the Nevatim base remained operational after and even throughout the attack. That cooperative system is what inspired German military experts Nico Lange and Lieutenant General Heinrich Brauss to put forward the idea of establishing air defense in bordering countries and in Ukraine. Seeing what can happen when allies come together to defend an impacted airspace, the German parliament members, or MPs, brought Lange and Brauss's notion of Germany and NATO doing the same for Ukraine. Perhaps surprisingly, even the opposing political forces, the Greens, the Free Democratic Party, and the Christian Democratic Union, agreed that this was a good idea. Roderich Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union pointed out that this joint action would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. He also mentioned the April attack on Israel as an example, emphasizing that the allies involved in Israel's defense didn't automatically become parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, this argument, as well as the unexpected unity in the Bundestag, wasn't enough to sway the German government to take direct military action in support of Ukraine. This means that Germany isn't allowed to enter the Ukrainian airspace, at least for now. The mere fact that this proposition was even discussed by the Bundestag and attracted so much attention suggests that Germany is reconsidering its role in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and pushing the boundaries of its commitment to collective defense. If you remember, Bundestag member Anton Hofreiter, who we mentioned earlier, saw this plan being carried out in the long run, so Germany's role in the conflict is likely to continue to evolve. But why hasn't Germany already taken this decisive action to enter the Ukrainian airspace? Well, there are multiple hurdles standing in the way of this historic action. We've already briefly brushed on the first and arguably the most important one. Germany is simply scared that entering Ukraine, even indirectly, would trigger an all-out war with Russia. And let's be honest, a direct conflict with Russia is the last thing Germany would want, especially when both world wars Germany had previously fought against Russia ended disastrously for Germany. And Germany isn't the only one with concerns about escalations. Fear of a greater conflict is also the reason why the US and the UK refused to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the same way they defended the Israeli airspace. The UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron put it bluntly, saying that deploying NATO forces even indirectly might lead to escalation in terms of a wider European war. Never one to fear an adversary, the US explained its refusal to get involved in a slightly different way. When asked about protecting the Ukrainian airspace with the US defense systems, the White House National Security Council's Strategic Communications Coordinator, John Kirby, pointed out the difference between the Ukrainian and Israeli scenarios. He summed up his difference in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. And to be fair, Kirby's right. Protecting Ukraine would be significantly more challenging than defending Israel from a purely military perspective. Ukraine shares a longer border with Russia, and the conflict zone is vast, with multiple fronts and shifting battle lines. This makes it difficult to establish a clear and secure airspace over Ukraine, especially given Russia's air defense systems and military capabilities. But let's say Germany and other Ukrainian allies move past this fear and commit to protecting Ukrainian airspace at all costs. Is this protection even feasible in the long run? As things currently stand, the answer is a resounding no. Remember, the Iranian attack on Israel was an isolated incident, while protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be an ongoing and complex operation, one that the European allies simply don't have enough air defense systems to sustain. As Markus Faber of Germany's Free Democratic Party pointed out, there are a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So for Germany to even think about defending Ukraine's airspace against Russia, it would first have to secure more defense systems. Only under those circumstances would it be possible to deploy Western air defense systems to protect the sky over Ukraine. And let's face it, Ukraine is no Israel. The country doesn't have the groundbreaking Iron Dome or state-of-the-art F-35s. The country waited for what it seems like forever to even get its hands on the few dozen F-16s it does now have. Throw the damage inflicted by Russia in the months of conflict into the mix, and you'll understand why protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be simply overwhelming. It becomes even more worrisome when you consider that Russian drones seem to keep coming. The country is going all in on so-called kamikaze drones designed to carry explosives, loiter around the target for quite some time, and then crash into it. At first, Russia imported these drones from Iran, opting for the Hesse Shahed 136 models. Since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has reportedly fired over 4,500 of these destructive drones at Ukrainian targets. But it gets worse. Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones at domestic production facilities by the summer of 2025, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine's already weakened air defense. Of course, Ukraine isn't standing idly by. The country's own drones are getting smarter in an effort to dodge Russia's jamming signals. This allows Ukraine to carry out more effective defensive measures while underscoring the country's continual efforts to adapt to the evolving threat posed by Russia. But how long can Ukraine go on its own? Certainly not for too long. The country's drone interception rates are already decreasing drastically, mostly due to the sheer volume of drones being deployed by Russia. Will this be enough to prompt Germany to go through with entering Ukraine? For now it seems plausible, but it's still not close to fruition. Russia has already accused Germany of entering the Ukraine war, so the country might just as well get directly involved. The accusation came in March 2024, in the aftermath of a leaked conversation between top German officials. Believe it or not, these officials discussed war plans on an unsecured phone line, thus breaking the fundamental protocols of secure communication. Unsurprisingly, Russia managed to intercept this call. The call was then recorded and leaked via Russia Today, the country's state-controlled media outlet. During the call, the German officials discussed the possibility of sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the potential impact of this move on the war. A potential target of these missiles would be the highly protected Crimean Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea. As a response to the leaked conversation, Russia summoned German Ambassador Alexander Graf Lambsdorff and registered an official protest. The country saw this conversation as proof that Germany was indeed trying to enter the war in Ukraine, questioning whether German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had lost control over his country and parliament. Russia's response also clearly defined their red lines when it comes to Germany's involvement in Ukraine. Even sending the Taurus missiles would mean Germany is entering the war, which would likely prompt Russia to respond accordingly. But what is it about these Taurus missiles that makes them such a threat to Russia? It's simple, really. The Taurus missiles, jointly developed by Germany and Sweden, are considered one of the most advanced weapon systems in use today. This missile is about 16.5 feet long, weighs 1.4 tons, and can be fired from the air via fighter jets. When fired, it travels at speeds of up to 727 miles per hour, almost the speed of sound, and locates targets that are as far as 300 miles away. Plus, this long-range missile flies at low altitude, only about 114 feet, which makes it nearly impossible to detect with radars. Germany uses Taurus missiles to tackle high-value targets, such as enemy command posts and bunkers. Taurus missiles can penetrate several reinforced concrete walls before the actual warhead explodes, which makes bunkers susceptible to their power. Currently, Germany has around 600 Taurus missiles, 150 of which are ready for deployment. But as things stand, Ukraine won't see a single one of these valuable missiles. Even before the leaked call, Scholz was adamant about not sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and he stood firm on this stance time and again. Why? Because of a deep-seated fear of Russia, according to many experts. Though he describes his stance as prudence and not weakness, it's abundantly clear that he believes that supplying Ukraine with this weapon would provoke Putin to such a degree that he would likely retaliate against Germany. So if you're keeping score, that's two things Germany can't do to directly help Ukraine. It can't enter its airspace or send game-changing missiles. And of course, it also can't enter Ukraine in the conventional way, by sending troops. But this isn't surprising. Since the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies reiterated that no troops would be sent to Ukraine. After all, the country isn't a NATO member, which severely limits the alliance's formal obligations to provide military support. The idea of sending troops to Ukraine became a point of controversy due to a statement made by French President Emmanuel Macron in February 2024. Macron stated, "There is no consensus today to send ground troops officially, but nothing is ruled out." He then added, "We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war." Of course, these statements sent shockwaves across Europe. Macron didn't seem too fazed as he reaffirmed this possibility in May 2024. His exact words were, "I'm not ruling anything out, because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." But unlike Macron, Scholz did rule out this possibility, loud and clear. Scholz said there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil who are sent there by European states or NATO states. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg shared the same sentiment, emphasizing that there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. This raises the total to 3 things Germany can't do for Ukraine. But just because Germany can't enter Ukraine just yet doesn't mean it's leaving the country to fend for itself. If you remember, we mentioned that Germany is Ukraine's single largest donor in Europe. So rather than dwelling on all the things Germany can't do, let's review what the country can do, and has done so far. Number 1. Provide military aid. Germany might not be able or willing to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but this in no way lessens the sheer amount of military aid the country has sent so far. If we're talking numbers, Germany has spent approximately $1.7 billion on military assistance to Ukraine in 2022 and $5.3 billion in 2023. So far in 2024, Germany announced plans to ramp up military aid for Ukraine by another $4.1 billion. And this comes after the Bundestag approved a staggering $8.2 billion in military assistance for Kyiv in 2024. But how is this money being spent? Germany's financial commitment to Ukraine is channeled into various crucial areas that significantly enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities. This includes some $300 million spent on training over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. It also covers the advanced weaponry and equipment Germany sent to Ukraine. The money either accounts for the replacement of weapons sent from the stockpiles of the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, or the country's defense industry deliverables. Though Germany's military aid for Ukraine covers virtually all combat areas, assistance in the Air Defense Department probably interests you the most, given the topic of the video. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Germany has sent a range of sophisticated air defense systems to Ukraine, significantly enhancing the country's ability to protect its skies. This includes 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, and 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems. But there are 2 air defense systems that made the biggest difference: the Iris and Patriot defense systems. So far, Germany has sent 4 Iris-T SLM and 2 Iris-T SLS air defense systems to Ukraine, together with their corresponding missiles. The SLM variant tackles short-range missiles up to 7.5 miles of range and 5 miles of altitude. The SLS variant deals with medium-range missiles, having a maximum range of roughly 25 miles and a maximum altitude of 12.4 miles. So far, these systems have reportedly had a 100% success kill rate in Ukraine, even when faced with the notorious kamikaze drones. As for the Patriot air defense system, Germany has sent 2 of these systems to Ukraine so far, with the corresponding missiles included. Compared to the Iris system, the Patriot air defense offers a broader range of capabilities and enhanced performance. It's designed to counter high-speed, high-altitude threats such as ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as advanced aircraft. From this description alone, it's easy to understand why Ukraine relies on these air defense systems so immensely, especially given how lackluster the country's native systems are. But 2 Patriot systems aren't nearly enough. According to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country needs at least 25 to successfully defend its territory. Germany only plans to give 1 more system in the future, but at least it's going all out on missiles, announcing a shipment of 100 Patriot air defense missiles in June 2024. Number 2. The use of German weapons against targets in Russia. This might be the closest Germany will come to directly entering the Russo-Ukrainian conflict so far. In May 2024, the country authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil using the weapons Germany is supplying. This authorization came right after the US did the same, which was seen as a groundbreaking policy change. Ukraine was allowed to use these weapons to defend the border region of Kharkiv, 12 miles from Russia, which has been mercilessly attacked by Russian forces throughout May. With 2 of the most direct military involvement measures out of the way, let's quickly list other ways in which Germany has helped Ukraine since 2022. Number 3. It's imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions on Russia, hoping to financially dismantle the country's almighty war machine. Number 4. Germany has sent massive amounts of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, ensuring that medical care, food, and clean water reach the Ukrainian people quickly. Number 5. Germany has provided direct financial aid to Ukraine to allow the country to stabilize its financial systems amidst the ongoing conflict. Number 6. German high-ranking officials have tirelessly pleaded with other allies to send more aid to Ukraine, placing special emphasis on air defense. Though these pleas have seemingly failed to secure the crucial air defense systems, many countries have been making smaller pledges in response to Germany's efforts. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the following countries have promised to send additional aid as a direct response to the country's efforts: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Lithuania, Norway, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, the UK, and the US. Number 7. Germany has vowed to help rebuild Ukraine and is already planning national and international short-term and long-term support. Number 8. Germany has been actively helping refugees from Ukraine, supporting them financially and protecting them socially. And number 9. Germany has supported the efforts of the International Criminal Court to document the war crimes Russia committed in Ukraine, both financially and by directly collecting evidence. This extensive list leaves us with a single question: from where does Germany's tremendous willingness to help Ukraine come? Some experts see this support as a result of Germany's commitment to international law and human rights, as well as basic sympathy for the Ukrainian people. However, the more pragmatic analysts point to a combination of strategic, economic, and political factors that drive Germany's extensive support for Ukraine. Chief among them is the fear that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will follow suit. As German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock put it, ultimately it's about one thing: supporting Ukraine keeps the war away from us. Of course, there are also those who claim that Germany simply can't seem to shake its World War II guilt, which fuels its foreign policy decisions and a remarkable commitment to peace and stability. But what camp are you in? Why do you believe Germany is helping Ukraine so extensively, and do you see the country entering Ukraine directly or indirectly anytime soon? Share your opinions in the comments section below. Now go and check out Germany Wants to Get Involved in the Ukraine War, or click this other video instead. Ukraine has been on a knife edge in its war with Russia over the last year. During that time, it's been forced to confirm that its counter-offensive, which was designed to push Vladimir Putin's troops back, had failed, and it's been gradually losing territory to the Moscow steamroller. Russia has been taking ground. Avdiivka represents perhaps the largest victory for Putin over the last year of the war. The city, which Ukraine had transformed into a fortress, fell in 2024 after Moscow committed wave after wave of attack, beginning in October 2023. Putin hailed the taking of Avdiivka as being hugely important for Russia, not least because controlling the city means Ukraine loses its main route into Donetsk. Along with that victory, Russia has made some serious inroads into Bakhmut, as well as taking several villages around Zaporizhia. Some commentators say there's now a stalemate on the front lines. That's not the case. Russia is advancing thanks to its ability to constantly bombard Ukrainian positions with artillery and troops. The war of attrition has been playing out in Putin's favor, not least of which because he has the funds to support his war effort at a time when Ukraine has started to run low. But that's all changed. And with that comes the possibility that Ukraine could be on the verge of destroying Putin's ambitions. All of which brings us to the key questions we'll answer in this video. What's the seismic change that's happened that will allow Ukraine to finally push back against Russia? And perhaps more crucially, what does this mean for Putin's ambitions, not just in Ukraine, but the rest of Europe? The answer to the first of those questions is simple. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have approved massive aid packages that are going to be a major help to Ukraine in the months to come. We'll start with the UK's package. On April 23, 2024, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak travelled to Poland for a meeting in which he aimed to strengthen the country's security ties with one of Europe's emerging military nations. During that meeting, he announced that the UK had approved a £500 million, approximately $620 million, aid package that would account for the country's largest ever delivery of military equipment to a wartime ally. The announcement brought the UK's funding total in Ukraine up to $3.7 billion for the financial year, with most of the money going toward funding equipment that Ukraine desperately needs to fend off the Russian offensive. Among that equipment will be 60 boats, including raiding craft, dive boats, and maritime guns that can be used both to fend off any Russian naval offenses as well as provide Ukraine with options for making inroads into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. The UK will also provide 400 military vehicles split between 78 all-terrain vehicles, 160 Husky vehicles, which come with protective armor, and a further 162 armored vehicles of different types. Plus, the UK will bolster Ukraine's missile stocks. The money will pay for 1,600 air defense and strike missiles that may help Ukraine deal with Russia's constant bombardments. Add to that a small number of Storm Shadow long-range guided missiles, which are capable of traveling for about 150 miles, providing Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets from a great distance, and you have a comprehensive equipment package. And that's not all. The UK will also provide Ukraine's ground soldiers with 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, as well as support from its engineering industry. There's also mention of supplying drones in the press release announcing the aid package. The UK's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was bullish when speaking about the package, pointing out that the UK was the first to provide Ukraine with modern tanks, long-range missiles, and NLAW anti-tank missiles. Now we are going even further. We will never let the world forget the existential battle Ukraine is fighting, and with our enduring support, they will win. Those are big words. But as impressive as the UK's aid package may be, alone it would not be enough to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. At best, it would give Ukraine enough ammunition to defend itself for a few more months, but more is needed for Ukraine to stand any chance of destroying Putin's hope of taking the country. Enter the United States. After months of political wrangling, the US Senate has finally approved a massive $95 billion aid package. Signed and sealed by President Joe Biden, that money will go to supporting Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with the latter getting the lion's share of the funding. According to the BBC, it's expected that $61 billion of that money will be dedicated to providing military aid to Kyiv, making the package about 10 times the size of that being delivered by the UK. The package has been a long time coming. As Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pointed out, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. Defense One offers more details on how Ukraine will likely spend the money. It says that $13.7 billion will go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which works on behalf of Kyiv to procure new weapons. Another $1.6 billion will go to a similar weapons acquisition scheme, the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is overseen by the US State Department. Add to that $13.4 billion that will be used to replace weapons the US has already sent over that have since been lost in the war, along with funding for further training of Ukrainian troops, and you have a substantial aid package, albeit one that comes with a few strings attached. Those strings include provisions in the bill that the US can withdraw the funding if Ukraine doesn't spend the money in a way that the US sees as fitting. That seems unlikely. America is already working closely with Ukraine in terms of how it spends the funds, with most of it being dedicated to purchasing American equipment that Ukraine needs anyway. Ukraine can deal with that. It's also important to point out that Ukraine isn't getting all of that money, or the equipment that it will buy, in one go. Defense One says that the first tranche of weapons the US will send to Ukraine under the new aid package will have a total of $1 billion, about a 60th of the total aid. The package is likely to include anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, along with 155mm shells, armored vehicles, and long-range rockets. Unfortunately, there are no specific numbers at the time of creating this video, though it's safe to assume they'll be somewhat similar to the UK's. And there's more. Along with finally passing the bill for aid to Ukraine, the US House of Representatives has passed another bill that could be just as damaging to Putin. A bill that allows the US to seize Russian assets held in American banks before transferring them to Ukraine for its war effort. That bill still needs to make it through the Senate, but if it passes, it would represent a bold move by the United States that could see it free up around $67 billion in assets that would essentially double the aid package it's sending to Ukraine. That bill could also serve as a trigger for other nations to do the same. After all, the $67 billion in frozen assets that the US holds is just a fifth of the $300 billion plus of frozen assets held around the world. According to Russia's central bank, Moscow has around $207 billion invested in the euro, along with $37 billion invested in the British pound. There are also tens of billions of dollars invested into the Japanese yen and Canadian and Australian dollars. Imagine what would happen if the nations controlling these currencies all followed America's lead. Ukraine would suddenly have access to over $300 billion of Russia's frozen money, which it could use to fund its defense. Of course, Putin has been quick to call any type of seizure illegal and has threatened retaliation if it happens. So the fact that the US even has a bill at all, never mind one that's passed through the House of Representatives and seems to have support of key Republican Party players, suggests that the wider world is ready to take a more aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's attempts to take Ukraine. And that brings us neatly to the second question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why does the renewed aid the United Kingdom and the United States providing to Ukraine spell such bad news for Putin? There are several answers to this question, starting with the most obvious one. The aid bolsters Ukraine's defense at a time when Russia has been slowly pushing it back in a devastating war of attrition. Right now, Russia controls around 18% of Ukrainian land, which it's managed to gain by virtue of having more equipment and manpower. That equipment advantage has come to the fore in Russia's reliance on constant missile and drone barrages over Ukrainian cities, which are supplemented by its ability to send soldier after soldier into the fight with seemingly no sign of letting up. That strategy is unlikely to change in the short term. In 2024 alone, Russia has already captured 138 square miles of Ukrainian territory, and if Ukraine's defense intelligence heads are to be believed, is planning to launch a renewed offensive at some point during May 2024. That offensive will likely focus on the small town of Chaziv Yar in Donetsk. That would be bad news for Ukraine, because the capture of that town would open the way to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, two Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbas region. Chatham House also believes it's likely that Putin will intensify Russia's missile and drone strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, logistical routes, and industrial base. All have suffered in recent months from a lack of air defenses. And it's here where we may see the tide start to turn. As part of its aid package, the United States is supposedly providing a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine, with that system being capable of shooting down many of the types of missiles that Russia will use in these attacks. Germany has also committed to sending one, with Greece and Spain also facing increasing pressure to transfer their Patriot systems to Ukraine. Add to that the money Ukraine can now access, which it would use to purchase more Patriot missile systems, along with the ammunition they require, and the country is now in a better position to defend itself against missile strikes. Why is that such bad news for Putin? It's possible that Russia might start running low on missiles if it has to start firing more to achieve the same results it enjoyed before Ukraine got access to these new Patriot systems. Back in January 2023, Ukrainian intelligence officers started to suggest that Russia was running low on its ballistic missile stocks. A Ukrainian Air Force official named Yuri Inat suggested that Moscow had fewer than 100 of its Iskander missiles left due to its repeated strikes throughout 2022, forcing it to rely on its weaker S-300 and S-400 systems. The S-300s date back to the days of the Soviet Union, making them less reliable than their supposedly dwindling modern alternatives. Their use, suggested Inat, meant that Russia must be running low on ballistic missiles. But that was over a year ago, and the barrages kept coming. Still, it highlights the equipment and munitions challenges both face in what has become the modern example of what industrialized ground warfare looks like. According to Reuters, Russia has already fired 8,000 missiles, along with sending 4,630 Shahid drones into Ukraine. It's making and buying more, but that rate of use will eventually mean Moscow starts to run low, with Ukraine being aided by its new missile defense systems to put an even more severe dent in Moscow's missile stockpiles. In short, Putin may not be able to rely on his missile barrages for as long as he would have done without the aid packages. And given that those packages include supplying Ukraine with more missiles of its own, he may also find that the ground Russia has already taken in the country could be subjected to the very same missile strategies he used to take that ground in the first place. But Putin has a workaround for that problem, one he's already been using to great effect in Ukraine: glide bombs. In an interview with the UK's Times radio station, Professor Michael Clarke, a fellow of King's College in London, discussed Russia's use of these bombs. Specifically, he highlighted the Fab 500 and Fab 1500 variants, which are capable of carrying warheads weighing 1,102 pounds and 3,306 pounds respectively. These are very old bombs. They're not equipped with the precision-guided systems that modern missiles have, though their payloads are so massive that it doesn't really matter. As long as Russia can drop the bombs in proximity of their targets, they don't need direct strikes. The bombs can still cause damage. Clarke points out that Moscow has found a way to fit small wings to these bombs, giving them the ability to glide towards a target after being dropped from an aircraft. That's been huge for Putin. One of Russia's planes can drop a glide bomb from 30,000 feet in the air while being 50 miles behind the front lines and still know that it's likely to hit its target. The bombs were crucial to Russia's taking of Avdiivka. According to Le Monde, one Ukrainian fighter said, "These bombs completely destroy any position. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one KAB, a term used for the glide bombs. And they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in just one day," the soldier concluded. Countering those bombs is going to be a huge challenge for Ukraine. The only thing Ukraine can really do, according to Clarke, is take out or chase off the Russian planes that are dropping the bombs in the first place. That's where the Patriot systems may come into play again, as their range is such that they can target and hit Russian planes stationed 50 miles behind the front lines, potentially taking them out of the game before they can launch their deadly payloads. Again, another huge boon for Ukraine. If it's able to get its hands on more fighter jets, the Netherlands will provide it with 6 that were previously meant for sale in the US, as of a February 2024 report. It could even take the fight to those bomb-dropping planes. These are all little steps. And given that the funding is staggered, as well as Ukraine having to wait for equipment to arrive before it can deploy it, it's likely that Russia will still manage to advance in the near term. But with the new defensive systems in place, Ukraine can stem the bleeding and potentially take advantage of Russia's munitions starting to dry up at a key point where it's receiving a fresh load of weaponry and equipment. Ukraine will also be able to counter the glide bombs, albeit only partially, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield to the point where Ukraine can hold its cities for longer. And that ability to hold for longer is another reason why the UK's and America's aid packages could destroy Putin's ambitions. It will lead to Russia losing more soldiers. In his interview, Clarke highlights that Russia is still losing around 900 soldiers per day to a Ukraine that is war-weary and running out of equipment. It's been able to sustain those losses because of the sheer size of its army. According to Global Firepower, Russia ranks 5th in the world for active military personnel with 1.32 million, and it has 2 million reservists along with 250,000 paramilitary members. Moscow won't run out of people anytime soon. Its problem comes in funneling those huge numbers into Ukraine, which has become a slightly easier task now it controls territory in the country. But even with that territory, losing 900 people per day is a massive burden. Now that Ukraine has enough money to purchase more artillery shells and small arms ammunition, its ground troops will be able to kill even more of Putin's soldiers. That doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine will be able to force a counterattack with this funding, according to Clarke. But it does mean that Russia will be forced to sustain higher losses than it has over the last few months, potentially weakening its hold on territory it's taken during 2023 and the first part of 2024. In short, Ukraine now has what it needs to start pushing Russia back. And that gives Ukraine 2 things that it hasn't had in a long time: breathing room and the ability to plan for the future. Now that it's better able to fend off attacks, Ukraine's frontline forces won't be in the state of panic and chaos that Russia has placed them under for much of 2024. They'll be able to launch coordinated attacks with the equipment to back them up, as well as better coordinate their defenses against Russian assaults. Clarke speculates that this could slow down the Russian advance to the point where the war returns to the stalemate position it seemed to be during the beginning of 2023, giving Ukraine valuable time to plan how to use its new resources both to defend and attack. As for the control issue, Ukraine now has stability in terms of knowing what's coming in and where. It knows that the UK is going to deliver 60 boats, 400 vehicles, and 1,600 missiles, with that knowledge allowing it to plan ahead on how to maximize that equipment rather than being in a position where it has to constantly scramble to react to Russian attacks. The same will go for America's military aid package. It all feeds into giving Ukraine more control in the conflict and buoys the morale of troops that have been seeing their supplies constantly dwindling over the past year. That's not what Putin wants. As Clarke points out in the Radio Times interview, Putin's strategy has been to slowly put the squeeze on Ukraine by forcing it to face up to what felt like insurmountable odds. He knew Ukraine was running low on equipment. All he had to do was keep pushing, slowly but surely, perhaps to the point where he could force a political crisis in the country. That crisis may have been the ousting of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and opening the door to a new leader who was sympathetic to Putin's ambitions. A leader who might hand over the territory Russia has already captured to keep the peace. That's not going to happen anymore, at least not for the next year, according to Clark. He highlights these new aid packages could restore Ukraine to the point where it's again able to expend the 10,000 artillery shells it was using to keep Russia at bay near the beginning of the war, creating a stalemate situation again right as Russia looks set to push deeper into Ukraine. Clark believes that Putin thought that the aid packages, particularly the one from the United States, wouldn't get through the Senate. Now he faces a situation where Ukraine has a renewed flow of supplies that will increase troop morale and could lead to Russia's soldiers facing a much harder fight than they faced for the last year. Does that mean Putin will be forced to leave Ukraine? Not necessarily. But there's another element to this aid package that is huge for the potential outcome of the war and may play the biggest role in destroying Putin's ambitions. It's a sign that the rest of Europe is waking up to the threat that Russia poses. Take the UK as a perfect example. When speaking about the country's most recent $620 million package, Rishi Sunak made it clear that the package represented the UK getting on a war footing for the first time in decades. The aid pledge came with another that would see the UK increase its defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, amounting to around $93 billion over the next 6 years, with Sunak calling it the biggest strengthening of our national defense for a generation. He went on to point out that the world is the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, while warning against taking a complacent approach that would see Russia take Ukraine and potentially turn its attention to other European countries. The country also intends to invest around $12 billion into ammunition production, likely as a result of having seen Russia's tactics in Ukraine. There are signs of the British war machine starting to activate elsewhere. Beyond sending aid to Ukraine, the UK has also announced that it intends to deploy some of its Typhoon fighter jets to Poland, giving Poland more options when it comes to policing its skies. It's not outside the realms of possibility that those jets will be there to keep an eye on what Russia does should it take Ukraine. After all, as AP News points out, Poland has already seen Russian incursions into its airspace since the war in Ukraine began. Even more worrying for Putin is that it's not just the UK that's on notice. The rest of Europe is quickly figuring out that the Russian war machine might target them next. Before the UK and the US announced their aid bills, the EU had agreed to send $53 billion in financial support between 2024 and 27. Rather than being dedicated to funding military equipment, the EU said the money could be used to keep the country's administration running. More bad news for Putin, as well as paying for salaries, pensions, and public services. So there's funding coming from two fronts, military and civilian aid, that could strengthen Ukraine in its fight against Russia. America's substantial aid package also places pressure on many European countries to follow suit with packages of their own. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed massive amounts already, with the latter having committed 1.5% of its GDP to Ukraine, with Estonia and Lithuania committing 1.8%. Germany is delivering a Patriot system to Ukraine, as mentioned earlier, with the country already having established itself as the biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine behind the United States. And of course, we have France's President Macron talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia is still on the table, even if the rest of NATO's leaders claim that's an impossibility. These are far from the only examples, but all prove that Europe is increasingly concerned about Putin's ambitions, both for Ukraine itself and for the rest of the continent, should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Again, that's not what Putin wanted. His invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a smash and grab. The country was supposed to roll over in a matter of months, accept that it would become part of Russia, and the rest of Europe would just have to deal with it. Instead, Ukraine has held on. It's now being buoyed by financial aid that will allow it to fight for another year, and Putin is having to watch as the rest of Europe mobilizes production, while committing even more money to Ukraine, so it'll be ready to fight if Putin turns his attentions beyond Ukraine. It all adds up to Russia potentially losing steam in Ukraine. Putin has already responded by threatening to increase the rate of missile strikes in Ukraine in response to America's aid bill passing. Through his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, Putin said that Russia will increasingly target storage bases and logistics centers for Western weapons in response. Russian propaganda has also started the nuclear weapons conversation again, with Newsweek reporting on April 29th that state TV channel Russia 1 news anchor Dmitry Kiselyov has talked about Russian nuclear launches on the air. He said that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, Russian nukes would not only disarm France in an instant, a clear shot at Macron, but would target American decision-making centers. Those words may not come directly from Putin, but they come from a prominent figure on Russian state-sponsored television, meaning we can assume Putin approves. And as Clark concludes in his interview with Times Radio, the renewed threats of nuclear war could be a sign that Russia is worried. It knows Ukraine is going to get a heavy injection of military equipment, and that injection may just be a heavy enough dose to stop the Russian war machine in its tracks. But what do you think? Could the announcement of financial aid from the UK and the US help Ukraine to turn the tide in the war? Is it all a case of too little too late? And is Putin genuinely worried about the rest of Europe mobilizing in the wake of his invasion? Are his plans going to come crumbling down? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defence issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing onto Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic, since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell (ERFB). These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Fredriksson's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardom mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardom was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordom is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardom operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardom has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardom mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardom systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardom's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardom in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardom mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardom to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer. When the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive, the expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Frederiksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Frederiksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead.